Part 3, Emergence. Chapter 9, International Finance. No roomy, no room. They cried oxy when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. Alice in our wonderland. Overshadowed during the Civil War by his father's English firm and his own immaturity, J. Pierpont Morgan slowly but steadily acquired an independent identity and reputation. In spite of intense competition, Dabney, Morgan and Company by 1869 were considered among the important banking houses in New York City. A house of high repute doing an immense business. One. The basis of this business was still largely foreign banking, comparatively neglected by other American bankers and mostly carried on by agents of European houses, in which J.P. Morgan specialized. But J.S. Morgan and Company were the dominant factor in the House of Morgan at this time. Old Junius Morgan, the most important American banker in London, in addition actively participated in British international financial operations, his firm identifying itself with the British export of capital and imperialism. The larger scope and power of J.S. Morgan and Company were signalized in 1870 when they organized a syndicate to float a French loan of 750,000 francs. At the moment the Prussians were besieging Paris, that malignant ghost Louis Napoleon was a prisoner, and Junius Morgan's authorization issued by the new provisional government. The loan was risky and profitable. Taken at 80%, the bonds were offered to 86, the House of Morgan. Die Public at 85, the syndicate clearing $5 million in profits. One of the largest syndicate operations ever organized in London, the French loan broadened the influence of J.S. Morgan and Company independent of their American business. This American business, however, was still the chief interest of Junius Morgan, the export of British capital to the United States becoming again active. Among the many American issues sold in Europe by J.S. Morgan and Company was one of $4 million 6% Erie bonds. The Erie Railroad's credit was low, being in the stifling clutch of Daniel Drew, and its bonds priced at 75 to yield 10%. A few years later, Junius Morgan took from Andrew Carnegie $5 million of American railroad bonds, which neither American bankers nor the Barings would take. Carnegie at the time was on the make and cannily using every opportunity, as he himself illustrates in this report of a conversation with old Junius. Carnegie, I will give you an idea and help you to carry it forward if you will give me 1/4 of all the money you make by acting upon it. Morgan, smilingly, that seems fair. We ought to be willing to pay you 1/4 of the profit for. The confidence of British investors in Peabody and Company was retained and strengthened by J.S. Morgan and Company, who never, according to contemporary opinion, took part in the speculative schemes which, originating, to put it very mildly, in the brains of our oversanguine countrymen, led the British victims to speak of America as a land of speculators and adventurers. The majority of British investments in American securities were through the House of Morgan, and these investments were large. The very large purchases of American securities by British and other European investors was not simply due to this country's growing wealth and high investment returns. Investors were in the grip of larger forces. The world was international finance. Being industrialized in production, markets, and finance becoming more international. Capitalist industry depends upon widening markets to sustain an increasing production of goods and profits. Industrialized nations, particularly England, developed surplus goods and capital and searched everywhere in the United States, Asia, Africa, and Latin America for new markets and new sources of raw materials, as well as larger yields on invested money. In the forefront of the movement was the export of capital, precursing trade, railroads, factories, mines, international antagonisms, colonial conquest, and wars. In the United States, a strong, independent nation, the import of foreign capital simply accelerated industrialization. Transforming what was still partly a wilderness into a complex industrial nation, this country developed an insatiable appetite for new capital and goods. American foreign trade expanded swiftly after the Civil War. Business was on the upsurge, eager for new capital. American corporate enterprises secured large amounts of foreign capital, while after the Civil War, government bonds again became popular with European investors. The steady import of capital was interrupted in 1866 by the London money panic and by the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. But the interruptions were minor and temporary. In 1869, Europeans owned $1 billion of American government bonds out of a total of $2, $750 million and $465 million of American corporate securities. 8. Contemporary business opinion considered this imported European capital of prime importance, in spite of political spread eagleism and contemptuous flings by politicians about what have we to do with abroad. When the London and San Francisco Bank, financed by English investors, of which Dabney, Morgan and Company were the agents in New York and J.S. Morgan and Company in London, increased its capital. The action was greeted as an expression of the confidence of European capitalists in our future, whose purchase of railroad bonds and 87, 88. Other securities was necessary for carrying out our larger equal to enterprises. This import of capital constituted a business IRM, which power was potential. Railroad construction absorbed more foreign capital than equal to all other industrial enterprises. Immigrants flowed in by the millions, pioneers pressed against the western wilderness. Manufacturers sought new markets, speculators were attracted by large profits, and railroads multiplied almost overnight. These railroads opened up new lands, widened markets, and facilitated the geographic and corporate concentration of industry, constituting the most important factor in prosperity and industrial progress after the Civil War. Railroad construction projects tapped the reservoirs of capital accumulated during the war. Congress generously subsidized the western roads, and foreign investors were impressed by the yields on American railroad stocks and bonds, of which in 1869 they owned 243,000 pounds. 0,000. Between 1865 and 12,000 miles of new railroads were constructed, and by 1871, 500 million pounds had been invested in the transcontinental railroads alone. The Morgans, singly and in combination, sold millions of railroad securities to foreign investors. Among the issues floated by Dabney, Morgan and Company was one in 1869 of 6,500 pounds. 0.0007% gold mortgage bonds for the Kansas Pacific Railway, of which they were the New York bankers. Most of these bonds were sold in Europe, particularly Germany, and the balance advertised for sale to American investors. Dabney, Morgan and Company engaged in an unusually large newspaper advertising campaign, one-column and half-column advertisements appearing frequently. The bonds were described as a first-class investment, tax-free, and even better than gov. The House of Morgan. At this time, J.P. Morgan was already interested in the export of capital. Dabney, Morgan and Company, floating a Peruvian government loan of $2,000, 7% gold bonds, $500,000 of which were redeemed in 1871. New Times, April 9, 1871. International finance. Eminent securities, guaranteed by Kansas Pacific's high earnings and its government land grants. In spite of the heavy advertising and its superlatives, the sale of Kansas Pacific bonds moved slowly in the United States. The confidence of American investors in railroad securities was being shaken by the manipulations of financial buccaneers. In 1868, the North American Review had said, "In many instances, railroad managers have neither the ability nor the honesty, or, if one, not the other, needed to give confidence to persons who seek security as well as a good percentage for their capital." 10. Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, busily plundering the Erie Railroad, notoriously justified the criticism and frightened investors. The railroad buccaneers interfered with the orderly business of investment banking. In 1869, Morgan was to clash with Gould and Fisk and decisively defeat them. At every important stage in the development of the House of Morgan, there is the shaping influence of international finance. They are almost inseparable. Activity in international finance first helped the Morgans secure American financial power and then the world financial power they now possess. The earlier stage expressed the immaturity of American capitalism, the later stage its maturity, while the whole period expresses the development of world capitalism and of financial imperialism. There is a complex interplay of national and international forces, the dynamic movement of which decisively influenced the rise to power of the House of Morgan. The Kansas Pacific in 1873 defaulted on its bond issue. Commercial and Financial Chronicle, November 15th, 1873, p. 89. Chapter 10th, Morgan, Gould, Fisk. But we do cows cowbats, one wonder. And here Alice began, Io get rather sleepy, and went on saying to herself, in a dreamy sort of way, do cows eat bats? And sometimes, do bats eat cats? Alice, Indiana Wonderland. The railroads dominated economic activity after the Civil War. While expressing constructive economic progress, railroads were at the same time characteristic of the worst buccaneer practices. The plundering of corporations by speculators and managements was most active among the railroads, aggravated by financial and political corruption. Directors despoiled stockholders, depressed values, and forced railroads into bankruptcy, in spite of which, said the New York Tribune, the directors are still wealthy and out of prison. When the public was oppressed, scorned, helpless, but sneakingly admired the buccaneers and their profitable skullduggery. J. Pierpont Morgan did not participate in this saturnalia of manipulation, corruption, and plunder, which was not the least of the factors in the rise to power of himself and the House of Morgan. Neither men nor events can be separated from their age. Morgan developed in the midst of economic civil war, of an age of buccaneering. He was measurably animated by the spirit of the buccaneers, whom he met on their own terms and conquered. But his practice was much higher. Morgan was an organizer, an essentially integrating force where others were customarily disintegrating, his activity being identified with the more constructive forces of developing in. Morgan, Gould, Fisk. Industry and finance, and their class expression. While capitalism produced savage competition and buccaneering, it also produced the necessity of stabilization, of unity and order, the antitheses of unrestrained competition. Morgan responded to the necessity. The banker is usually a stabilizing force, and Morgan's temperament insisted on unity and order, which give the opportunity to rule. Objective conditions and temperament united to induce Morgan to wage war upon the buccaneers where their practices threatened the developing unity of industrial and financial interests. In 1869, when he was 32 years old, Morgan engaged in a struggle with Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, then plundering the Erie Railroad. The clash marked an important stage in the financiers' development. Morgan met the buccaneers on their own terms, using manipulation against manipulation, guile against guile, force against force, all their tricks, and conquered. The plundering of Erie was characteristic of the prevailing buccaneer practices. Erie was an important transportation project largely built by public money, the New York State Legislature and local governments contributing generously to the construction costs sought too, after which the Erie Railroad was allowed to come under the unregulated control of men like Jacob Little, the speculator, who used the road for speculative profit instead of public service. Its stock was manipulated by Daniel Drew, an unscrupulous, pious old fraud whose machinations are still a revelation in duplicity. Drew was as spidery as John D. Rockefeller without John D.'s supreme organizing talent. While a drover, he made the cattle drink immense amounts of water in order that they might weigh more and yield more money. The term watered stock was used subsequently to describe his watering of railroad stocks. Drew loved to manipulate stocks as other men loved to fondle women, and his penchant for short sales inspired the juicy couplet. 91-9, the House of Morgan. He who sells what isn't his'n must buy it back or go to prison. Drew's methods are revealed by one of his coups in 1866. Erie's stock was selling at 95. Drew had his agents sell stock at current prices for future delivery, and when the price rose, the agents sold still more stock short. Meanwhile, Drew, as Erie's treasurer, made the company a loan of $3,500,000, much of the money being Erie plunder, receiving as security 28,000 shares of unissued stock and $3,500,000 of convertible bonds. When the time approached to make good on his short sales, Drew took his collateral, converted the bonds into stock, and threw all into the market. Prices declined swiftly and disastrously. Drew made delivery on his short sales and reaped millions in profits. The depredations of Daniel Drew produced howls of anguish from his victims and demoralized Erie financially and in terms of operating efficiency. Businessmen complained of poor service and discrimination. The stockholders agonizingly observed the wrecking of their property, and labor growled at low wages and overwork. But what of it? Drew accumulated riches, and unrestrained accumulation was the prevailing ideal. The Erie Railroad now became an object of Cornelius Vanderbilt's desire. This picturesque old pirate, who by manipulation, driving energy, and organizing force had become the largest shipowner, whence the honorary title Commodore, and third richest man of his generation, suggested the original John Jacob Astor, uncouth, predatory, indifferent to things other than money and power. "Law?" cried the Commodore. "What do I care for law? Hain't I got the power?" In this spirit, when told certain plans conflicted with a statute, he said, "You don't suppose you can run a railroad in accordance with the statutes, do you?" Vanderbilt was master of all the buccaneering practices of the age: legislative and judicial corruption, corporate manipulation, financial jugglery. Morgan Gould, FIS 93 Bosnia and Herzegovina convertible marks. And stock watering. He was an unscrupulous, savage competitor. To some men who cheated him, Vanderbilt wrote, "I won't sue you, for law is too slow. I will ruin you." And he did for. In 1865, Vanderbilt, by refusing the New York Central Railroad connections with his Hudson River Railroad, demoralized Central's traffic, depressed the price of its stock, and acquired control. After watering the stock by doubling it, the Commodore proceeded to develop New York Central into one of the dominant railroad systems, and engaged in a struggle for control of Erie to monopolize New England business. In the preliminary clash for control, in 1867, Vanderbilt apparently won, and then decided to cooperate with Daniel Drew. The Commodore prepared to consolidate Erie and Central, dominate the Northeastern Railroad situation, and march triumphantly westward. But Drew prepared a treacherous stroke. On the Erie Board of Directors were Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, preparing their partnership in financial crime. Shrinkingly quiet, fox-like in stealth, and morally irreproachable, Gould was master of the methods of acquiring control and possession of other people's property, which he raised to the dignity of a fine art. Fisk was a flamboyant blatherskite and voluptuary, formerly a mountebank peddler who began to acquire wealth rapidly after becoming an Erie director and the accomplice of Drew and Gould. In spite of the agreement to cooperate with Vanderbilt, Drew united with Gould and Fisk to trick the Commodore. Vanderbilt kept on buying Erie stock for control, but the more he bought, the more there was to buy, the three conspirators issuing secretly more and more stock and throwing it on the market. "If this printing press don't break down," said Jim Fisk, "I'll be damned if I don't give the old hog all he wants of Erie." When Vanderbilt awoke to Drew's treachery, he immediately secured an injunction against Erie issuing new stock. But Drew and his accomplices flung another block of. 94, the House of Morgan. Stock on the market which Vanderbilt bought, never suspecting they would risk contempt of court. Contempt of the courts, however, was ingrained in the Buccaneers. This final outrage infuriated Vanderbilt. Threatened with arrest for contempt, Drew, Gould, and Fisk fled to New Jersey under cover of night beyond the New York court's jurisdiction, carrying with them in a coach plunder amounting to $7 million in currency. In Jersey City, the conspirators were guarded by a standing army of employees. The Vanderbilt party sent a gang of toughs to capture the Erie Depot and kidnap Drew, Gould, and Fisk, stores closed, citizens armed, and the militia prepared to intervene. The situation suggested barons waging war on each other. Jay Gould now started to work in characteristic fashion. The state legislature was prevailed upon to make Erie a New Jersey corporation beyond the reach of litigation in New York City. Then Gould went to Albany. Erie money poured out like water among the New York legislators, and the acts of Drew, Gould, and Fisk were legalized by a legislature shamelessly corrupt, hopelessly beyond the reach of public opinion. Cornelius Vanderbilt waged a war of litigation, in the course of which 2 judges were implicated in charges of bribery, one being impeached and the other resigning, to compel restitution of the money the conspirators had plundered him of, and although forcing a settlement of $47,750, 0,000 paid out of Erie's treasury, Vanderbilt was the loser by $2 million and Erie's control, .10 Jay Gould. The broad basis of his fortune originating in Erie plunder was now definitely on the way to his sinister, unscrupulous amassing of millions. Death in the midst of respectability and a funeral in which prominent multimillionaires, including J. Pierpont Morgan, deferentially participated. Old Commodore Vanderbilt's defeat in the Erie struggle was unprecedented. Always he had smashed opposition. Gould and Fisk now proceeded to consolidate their control of Erie. Morgan, Gould, Phys 95 Bosnia and Herzegovina convertible marks, by ousting treacherous Daniel Drew, distrusted by all. Erie had an empty treasury, but the conspirators demonstrated there were still millions to be made out of the wreck. Jim Fisk, himself an unmitigated thief, broke the systematic thieving among Erie employees, many being dismissed and others compelled to make restitution. 11. Gould made William Boss, Tweed a member of Erie's board of directors, securing the support of Tammany Hall, New York City's corrupt, undisputed masters, and their venal judiciary. Then the plundering began. In a few months, Erie stock was watered from 165,000 shares to 700,000, and the price falling to 35. The conspirators used Erie's money to bull the price to 62, cleaning up millions. 12. There were other sources of plunder besides manipulating the stock, Gould being subsequently sued for $9 million stolen from Erie and compelled to settle. It was against these apparently irresistible Buccaneers that J. Pierpont Morgan now waged a victorious struggle for control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, coveted by President Jay Gould of the Erie. For the first time, Morgan participated directly in railroad affairs. In January 1869, the Albany and Susquehanna was completed, consisting of 142 miles from Albany to Binghamton, and connecting with both the Erie and New York Central. Gould and Fisk determined to get control of Albany and Susquehanna and consolidate it with Erie. The consolidation would unite Erie with a network of roads running to New England and make Erie a formidable competitor of the New York Central in those regions. Erie, moreover, had acquired coal mines in Pennsylvania, actively competing for coal transportation business. And control of Albany and Susquehanna offered direct connections with the anthracite regions and immense power. In 1867, this pious old fraud endowed the Drew Theological Seminary, and the clerical recipient of the money said, "Oh, that we had one more Daniel Drew." The church needs the money of its wealthy friends. Nothing can be nobler than to give the funds and monies which God himself has bestowed. Meade Road, certain rich men, P95. 96, the House of Morgan, over competitors. The consolidation finally would facilitate Jay Gould's plans for control of the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad and competitive penetration of the West. Instead of the consolidation being motivated by economic and public considerations, it was inspired simply by Gould's ambition to build up a railroad empire for himself. As in the case of Erie, Albany, and Susquehanna had been constructed largely with public money, contributed by the state legislature in cash, while 22 towns subscribed for stock payable in bonds which the corporation sold in the market. 1. This enterprise now became the object of economic civil war. The declaration of war was issued by Jay Gould and Jim Fisk in the form of Erie purchasing Albany and Susquehanna stock. 2 large coal companies, competing for mastery in the northern Pennsylvania coal regions, projected their rivalry into the situation. One of them, the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, having advanced money to Albany and Susquehanna while under construction, was represented on the Albany and Susquehanna Board of Directors and constituted an opposition to President Joseph H. Ramsey. Erie allying itself with this opposition, Ramsey secured the support of Delaware and Hudson's competitor, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company. Gould and Fisk retaliated by withdrawing the Lackawanna-esque privilege to transport coal over Erie. 11. Meanwhile, Erie was buying Albany and Susquehanna stock, Jun Fisk issuing blustering declarations, and Jay Gould conspiring in the shadows. A directors' meeting approaching and half the board bind against him, President Ramsey was frightened and called Upor J.P. Morgan for help, not only to beat off Erie but to maintain his own control. Morgan, it appears, directed the subsequent campaign against the Erie-Gould-Fisk offensive. Morgan at this time was 32 years old, becoming substantial financier, but still unknown beyond the inn. P in a photo, Daniel Drew Fisk, Morgan, Gould, Fisk. Circle of Bankers, a write-up of Dabney, Morgan and Company in 1869 stressed Dabney's career but said nothing of Morgan. He was, however, master in his own house, in spite of being still in the shadows. Prepared to meet guile with guile and force with force, Morgan and Ramsey mapped out a campaign. Ramsey issued 3,000 shares of Albany and Susquehanna stock to Morgan, Dabney, and 7 others, Morgan and Dabney becoming members of the board of directors. It was an indication of the importance attached to the new affiliation and precipitated open war. The Gould-Fisk party resorted to the courts. Boss Tweed on the Erie Directorate was an asset and the Tammany judiciary favorable. Suit was brought against Albany and Susquehanna to declare unauthorized and void the 3,000 shares issued to Morgan and Dabney and prevent their being voted in the coming elections. The necessary injunction was issued by Judge Barnard, who in the Vanderbilt War had issued orders of arrest against Drew, Gould, and Fisk. Then the complacent judge issued some more injunctions, all within 15 minutes. One suspended Ramsey from the presidency of Albany and Susquehanna, and another appointed Jim Fisk and Charles Cuda receivers. Learning of the receivership proceedings, the Ramsey-Morgan party in Albany the same evening had a judge of their own appoint another receiver in the person of Robert H. Prune. The Gould-Fisk party retaliated by securing an injunction restraining receiver Prune, the county sheriff and Albany police, and all Albany and Susquehanna employees from interfering with receiver Fisk taking possession of the railroad. Each party had its own pliant judges, and the war became one of judge against judge, the judiciary participating actively in the civil war of competing corporations. Injunctions multiplied, about 22 in all, the orders of one judge nullifying another judge's orders. Unscrupulous lawyers thrived exceedingly. The legal profession itself was outraged, while 98, the House of Morgan. The press scored the indecencies and system of judicial abuse, producing a series of decisions made on both sides with an utter disregard of judicial proprieties. 21. In the midst of this litigation, the struggle went on for control of Albany and Susquehanna stock in preparation for the directors' meeting. Much of this stock was owned by towns served by the railroad, which legally could not be sold except at par, but was selling at 18% in the market. The Gould-Fisk party negotiated a purchase of $450,000 stock owned by towns on the basis of an agreement to buy the stock if it was voted for Gould and Fisk. This stroked the Morgan-Ramsey party answered by issuing 9,500 shares of stock to Ramsey's friends. Only 10% cash being paid with money borrowed by Ramsey himself on the security of Albany and Susquehanna bonds in the company's treasury. Receivers of the new shares obligingly gave Ramsey a proxy to vote them at the directors' meeting. 22. The transaction was an abuse of authority, wholly illegal. Duplicity against duplicity. Two corporations, Gould and Fisk acted in Erie's name, now proceeded to wage war with armed force, each party acting through a receiver legally appointed by complacent judges. Receiver Jim Fisk, the man of action carrying out Jay Gould's conspiratorial combinations, forcibly took possession of the Albany and Susquehanna depot at Binghamton with Erie employees assisted by the local sheriff upon order of Judge Barnard. Fisk then proceeded to Albany, accompanied by a bodyguard of toughs, to seize possession of the Albany and Susquehanna offices there. Excited and abusive, Jim Fisk marched in and shouted to his men, "Rush in, boys, and take possession." The Albany and Susquehanna superintendent ordered the invaders to get out. Fisk: "This is the 27th raid I've made, and I propose to take you men." Morgan, Gould, Fisk: "Superintendent, I hope you'll have a good time doing it." Fisk: "I'll take possession of the road if it costs millions and takes any number of men." Superintendent: "I am here by order of Mr. Prune, who has been appointed receiver by Judge Peckham." "Get out." Fisk: "I don't give a damn." "Boys, throw that gang out." 23. But the Morgan-Ramsey party was prepared to meet force with force. After a lively tussle in which furniture was smashed and heads cracked, the invaders beat a hasty retreat. A Ramsey-Morgan man masquerading as a policeman arrested Jim Fisk, brought him to a police station, shoved him in a door, and disappeared. 24. After being freed, Fisk returned to the Albany and Susquehanna offices, and there met Ramsey, who had been arrested for contempt of court on order of Judge Barnard and immediately released on order of a Ramsey-Morgan judge. Flippantly and characteristically, Fisk offered Ramsey to place 7 up for possession of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. 2 feet. 2 armed groups were now in possession of the Albany and Susquehanna. Receiver Fisk operating the Binghamton end of the road and Receiver Prune the Albany end. The Morgan-Ramsey superintendent determined upon an offensive, and with 450 men marched upon Binghamton while an Erie Fisk-Gould army prepared to invade Albany. Tracks were pulled up, trestles destroyed, and frogs put down to derail engines. The marching armies met and clashed at a tunnel 15 miles from Binghamton. An Erie engine approached an Albany and Susquehanna engine, each refusing to stop. There was a crash, 2 smashed engines, and a short but bloody battle. The Gould-Fisk party retreated to their entrenchments in the Binghamton depot, while the Morgan-Ramsey men tore up tracks, severed connections, entrenched themselves in the tunnel, and prepared for a new battle. The arrival of state troops prevented further strife. 28. Complete demoralization prevailed on the Albany ensues. 99. 100% the House of Morgan. Kahana, businessmen protested, and the press fulminated. Economic civil war was becoming a trifle unpleasant. The governor issued an ultimatum that the riotous operations must cease until the courts decided the issue of control, and threatened to take military possession of the railroad. J.P. Morgan now executed a clever maneuver. He prevailed on the Erie Gould-Fisk party to agree on a joint petition asking the governor to take possession of and operate the road, as it has become and is impracticable to operate the Albany and Susquehanna, sither under the management of the directors or the persons claiming to be receivers. 29. Jay Gould and Jim Fisk agreed. Since the governor owed his political preferment to their allies, Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, but they miscalculated, as the move was simply a part of Morgan's larger strategy to throw the case into the upstate courts beyond the Tammany Gould-Fisk judiciary's jurisdiction in New York City. Acting as an umpire in the contest of competitive business enterprise, the governor appointed a superintendent to operate the railroad and protect the rights of neutrals, business, and the public. 29. The belligerents, meanwhile, prepared for the September meeting to elect the board of directors of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, and another war of litigation. Chapter 11th Overtones, 1869. And then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. Alice in Wonderland. In May, 2 armies of workmen, mostly Irish immigrants and Chinese coolies, constructing the Union Pacific Railroad met at Ogden, Utah. The last spike was driven in, and the rails united. Ceremoniously, 2 locomotives chug-chugged on their way, completing one of man's great achievements, while the wires thrilled with the story of spanning a continent. Manufacturers dreamed glowingly of conquering Asiatic markets and ultimate control of the Pacific. Pioneers pressed onward in their terrible, demoralizing, magnificent struggle against nature, triumphing over deserts and mountains, exterminating Indians, making 2 blades of grass grow where none grew before. Clever men exploited the working pioneers and acquired enormous estates by plundering the government, the titles of scarcely any of the great Western estates being untainted by fraud. Technicians were revolutionizing industry, production multiplying, more goods and services becoming available to increasingly larger groups of the population, and small-scale industry threatened by the onward sweep of corporate enterprise. The National Labor Union suggested organizing Negro workers, while garment workers in Philadelphia started the Knights of Labor, proposing one-class organization of all workers and a new social order. The New York World commented sympathetically on labor's new ideal. 102. The House of Morgan, of unionizing skilled and unskilled workers regardless of craft to one. In the midst of the war for control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk actively engaged in other enterprises. In September, they engineered a corner in gold, in the interest of the farmers' crops, Gould blandly affirmed, after corrupting men high in the national government and smirching President Grant himself. The price of gold shot up disastrously, and Black Friday brought panic and ruin. At the height of the panic, Fisk and 2 of his lights of love drove in a carriage through Wall Street. There were threats to hang Gould and Fisk, and a Fisk one broker said, "I'll buy a revolver and blow hell out of him." The conspirators barricaded themselves in the Erie offices, protected by thugs and police against hostile crowds. Then government intervened, the Treasury selling gold and breaking the corner. But Gould, realizing the collapse of the conspiracy, secretly sold gold short and cleaned up millions in spite of the failure of the original plans, cheating his own partner, Fisk. 8. Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, however, were still accepted as honorable and substantial citizens, participating some weeks later in the public ceremony unveiling a statue to Cornelius Vanderbilt. Among other notables were Daniel Drew, the Tammany Mayor Okie Hall, Admiral Stringham, USN, accompanied by his officers, United States District Attorney Pierre Pont, the Right Reverend Bishop Janes, August Belmont, Henry Clues, Chauncey M. Depew, and Colonel F.A. Conkling. Bishop Janes prayed that the authorities may be a terror to evildoers and supplicated God that, as riches and honors in this world had been heaped on Vanderbilt, he might devote all his ability to the cause of humanity and to seek to lay up treasures in heaven. Mayor Hall compared Vanderbilt to Franklin, Jackson, and Lincoln, a remarkable prototype of that rough-hewn American character which can carve the way of every humbly born boy to national eminence. Overtones, 1869, 103. Simultaneously, another ceremony was being staged by irreverent brokers in the New York Stock Exchange. Amid uproarious laughter, the brokers unveiled a statue to Commodore Vanderbilt, a tall figure draped in white, with a face expressive of little but idiocy, carrying a well-worn watering pot symbolizing the Commodore's tendency to water corporation stocks. Then an injunction staying further proceedings in the ceremony was served, signed G. Bernardo, satirizing Judge Barnard, who complacently issued the injunctions asked for by Vanderbilt, Gould, and Fisk. Jeeringly, the meeting decided to ignore the injunction. The chairman delivered an eulogistic speech. It is the use of water, not as a beverage, but as an element of public wealth, which has been the distinguishing characteristic of the achievements of Commodore Vanderbilt's later years. Of the participants in this mock ceremony, the New York World said, "The Commodore is the realized ideal of every one of them. He has done what they all admire and envy him for doing, and what they would all do if they could." A few blocks away from Cornelius Vanderbilt's statue, which cost $500,000, were New York City's worst slums, the squalid want, criminal woe, wretchedness and suffering of which no pen can describe. In one block lived 382 families, persons including children. The New York Times conservatively estimated there were 10,000 completely homeless children in the city, exposed to incessant and overwhelming temptation, who suffer severely in winter and stormy weather, a fearful mass of childish misery and crime. 8. Horatio Alger was writing his pluck and luck stories of rags to riches. An investigation in New York City revealed that the evil of child labor is as great as in England. Paper collar factories alone employed 1,500 to 2,000 children under 15 years of age. And some who were only 4 years old. One little girl tending a machine was so small, she had to stand on a box 18 inches high to reach her work. Manual 4, the House of Morgan. Of these children, after toiling 10 hours, attended 9. School. The elite of New York, coarse vulgar, with whom Monter is the principal thing, 10 cynically flaunted their riches in less than form of conspicuous consumption. Daniel Drew and J. Pierpont Morgan served as vice presidents of an association organized to build a memorial statue of George Peabody, who had just died. 11. In Pennsylvania, there was a terrible disaster in a coal mine operated by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company, which was mixed up in the war for control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. The women sit, with stifled cry, waiting the arrival of their dead. Fathers lay stiff in death, with arms about their sons. Some were kneeling, as if in prayer. Strong men were hand in hand with their fellows. Little notes of tenderness and affection written upon old fragments of paper to sweetheart, wife, or child are frequently found. There were no dead miners. Some bodies, badly bloated, are not recognizable. 12, insisting that it is a mockery of justice to term this disaster an accident. The New York Times declared the leave-alone principle may be pushed too far and demanded protective labor legislation, as did the New York World.1. The business community raised a relief fund of $15,000. Neither Drew, Gould, Fisk, nor Morgan was among the contributors. 14. New York City writhed under the exploitation of Tammany Hall, the rule of a dozen sordid men of selfish hearts and narrow brains who have plundered us of millions, made our elections a farce, and sold injustice at a price. 15 many businessmen were intimately and corruptly identified with Tammany, but others, among them Dabney, Morgan, and Co., were propagated Thanga Kale for action to investigate Tammany, misruled a 1. Sue Fernand, horrible barbarity, abuses, and degradation flourished in the New York almshouses. Men and women were bound with ropes and chains in dark, filthy verminous overtones, 1869, 105. Cells, and a strange, abnormal, hideous race of children is springing up owing to promiscuity among inmates and guards. 1 foot. Investigations revealed income tax frauds measured at 70% and corruption again rampant in the New York Customs House. 1. The Northern Pacific Railroad lobby in Washington was stigmatized as a gang of plunderers and beasts of prey. J. Cook distributed Northern Pacific stock among influential people, and the credit mobilier scandal was in the making. The whiskey ring frauds were mulcting the government of millions in revenue. While Grant eats clams and don't care two dams, President Grant did care for some things, however, proposing the purchase of Santo Domingo for $1,500 and dreaming of annexing Cuba, which Senator Charles Sumner opposed while himself maneuvering to force England to cede Canada to the United States. Former Secretary of State William H. Seward, who had purchased Alaska but had been foiled by Congress in his designs upon Santo Domingo, the Virgin Islands, and the Isthmus of Panama, busily preached the doctrine of manifest destiny, expansion in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Egypt celebrated completion of the Suez Canal, which Disraeli in a few years was to buy from a bankrupt Khedive, accelerating the onward sweep of British imperialism. John D. Rockefeller prepared plans for the creation of an empire in oil by ruthlessly crushing competition, the Standard Oil Company being organized in 1870. In October and November, strikes broke out on the Erie Railroad against wage decreases, arbitrary discharges, etc. Admiral Fisk declares he will not submit to dictation by the Erie workers, and gathering together 1,000 armed men, prepared to put down the revolt, although, said the New York Times. Io 6, the House of Morgan. The strikers have not manifested the slightest desire to disturb persons or property. In October, the Gold Fist directors of Erie were re-elected, and in November, 50,000 shares of new stock issued, 23. Accidents on the Erie were so numerous and terrible that newspapers appeared repeatedly with the headline, Erie Massacre, and a wag was composing a song to be sung by Jay Gould to his Confederate. Oh, Jimmy Fisk, my Joe Jim, well, never, never weary of squeezing every penny from the stockholders of Erie. And if by any chance, Jim, we to the gallows go, we'll sleep together at the foot. Oh, Jimmy Fisk, my Joe, .2. Chapter She, the Buccaneers beaten. Speak roughly to your little boy, and beat him when he sneezes. Alice in Wonderland. The war for control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad flared up again at the stockholders' meeting in September 1869. Each party came with half a dozen lawyers, Jim Fisk with a whole carpet bag full of injunctions, and the Ramsey Morgan party equally prepared. Neither Gould nor Morgan was present, but theirs was the strategy. This stockholders' meeting developed aspects of a circus. Crowds, police, blustering lawyers, injunctions, alarms. Life in the mass was drab, and the crowds thrilled to the war businessmen waged upon each other. Flamboyant Jim Fisk, arrayed in his usual fancy style, gay and frisky, was a crowd's particular delight, the sentimentalized buccaneer of whom later they sang, he never went back on the poor. As they sang of Jesse James, Jesse was a man, a friend to the poor, and of another bandit. He robbed from the rich and he gave to the poor. 2. Fisk fired the first gun at the meeting. It was an injunction by Judge Barnard restraining the voting of illegal and bogus shares, the shares issued to J.P. Morgan and others by Ramsey, in fact, restraining the voting of any but those shares of which the Erie Fisk Gould party knew they had a majority. Under these circumstances, the Ramsey Morgan party decided their only hope was to prevent an election and secured an injunction restraining the inspectors from receiving the votes. Fisk was prepared for the move, and prior to the serve. I-08. Ing of the injunction, his meeting removed the inspectors A&E, elected new ones to whom the injunction did not apply. Ross say thereupon served another injunction restraining the votus of certain shares, but these shares were voted by a receiver as appointed by Fisk. The upshot of these maneuvers emphasized Fisk's cons at the stockholders' meeting, and the Ramsey Morgan posse withdrew to organize a rival meeting. Fisk prepared as USU served an injunction on the meeting restraining the Rams inspectors from receiving votes on certain shares, and an order of arrest issued the day before by Judge Barnard on Rams and 3 other Albany and Susquehanna officers. From a notcher, Judge Ramsey immediately secured an order of release on BS. Each party now elected its own board of directors, the Race Board, including J.P. Morgan, and adopted a resolution accusing each other of fraud, violence, criminal, and more reprehensible practices. 4. Nothing being decided by the stockholders meeting, the W flared up again in litigation. 7 more lawsuits, more junctions, contempt of court proceedings, and many acres. Complete demoralization prevailed on the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, built to serve the people. Indignation flamed forth at the outrage, whereupon the Attorney General of T. State of New York, in the name of the people, brought S against Morgan, Gould, Ramsey, Fisk, and 42 others. 8 who were legal directors of Albany and Susquehanna, owing E case into the upstate courts, precisely W.L. Morgan had maneuvered for, although Gould and Fisk retained control of Erie's bow. BVC Tober sections, their position was shall el son equal to L. O. Leche developments appreciating. Leva, carry preparinate or the Albany and Susquehanna legal battle in the state Supreme Court Morgan execute. AGTUD and FK November Arce as an Erie stockholder Semmered A. S. Court OT. The House of Morgan. THE Buccaneers beaten 109, suspending Gould, Fisk, and their Confederates from serving as officers and directors of Erie, by reason of gross misconduct and abuse of their respective trusts and offices. Ramsey's suit was brought under a New York statute authorizing the Supreme Court to suspend any director of a corporation whenever it shall appear that he has abused his trust. In the petition, Ramsey charged that Gould, Fisk, and their Confederates were unscrupulous usurpers who, by a sort of legerdemain, usurped control of the stockholders' property, stole millions of Erie's money, impaired its credit and good repute, used the company's money for their gold speculations and corrupt political purposes, paid not a single dividend, and so demoralized service on the Erie as to bring calamities of unusual horror, damage, and death. In addition to suspending Gould, Fisk, and their Confederates as officers and directors, the court enjoined them from exercising any right, privilege, or authority in respect of the company or its franchises, rights of property, in any capacity whatever, until further order of the court. The Erie directors not suspended, moreover, were ordered not to elect new directors or have anything to do with the suspended directors and officers. Apparently, the Buccaneers' defeat was final and crushing. The Erie ring crushed, jubilated the New York Times, Messrs. Gould, Fisk, and their fellow conspirators are stripped of the authority they have abused and the power they have prostituted. Justice, though tardy, is on the right track at last. 7. Jubilation was premature, however, and Morgan's flank movement not as successful as appeared. The suspension order was issued on November 23 and served the next day. Gould and Fisk barricaded themselves in the Erie offices, protected by armed guards, and defied the court's order. Again, illegality resorted to the law. An upstate judge temporarily in New York City and outside his own jurisdiction was induced to issue an injunction staying all proceedings on the order sus. Know the House of Morgan, pending Gould and Fisk and forbidding its service. Then reliable Judge Barnard issued an injunction forbidding Ram. Say, to proceed with the suit, reinstating Gould and Fisk and forbidding them from neglecting to carry out any order OE the Board of Directors of Erie. 8. Contempt proceedings, more injunctions, arrests, large lawyers' fees, newspaper indignation at the proceedings. In the midst of this melodramatic litigation, Gould slipped off to Albany, and in his own peculiar fashion secured from the legislature an act prescribing that no suit could be brought in the state court to remove corporation directors by any private party aggrieved, but only by the state's attorney general. And the attorney general at the moment was Gould's man. While repulsed in his flank movement, Morgan conquered in the main offensive against the Erie conspirators. In December 1869, the Supreme Court of the state of New York rendered its decision in the Albany and Susquehanna case. The election of the Board of Directors headed by J. Pierpont Morgan was declared unquestionably valid, that of the Gould-Fisk party procured through conspiracy and fraud. Gould, Fisk, and their associates were perpetually restrained from bringing any new suits and proceedings in the case, and the Morgan-Ramsey party authorized to recover all costs. 10. Immediately, Morgan leased the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad TC, the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, and the price of the stools rose to 100, yielding excellent profits. 11. The decision was too favorable to the Morgan-Ramsey party, and on appeal the court sustained the legality of the Morgan directors' election but reversed the decision on costs and new suits and proceedings. 11. But new proceedings did not interest J. Gould anymore. In 1872, he was ousted from Erie by a group of English stockholders using Gould methods against Gould. For years, these English stockholders had been trying legal means to oust Gould from control of Erie in order. J. Gould, William H. Vanderbilt, T.H.E. Buccaneers Beaton M. stopped the plundering and resumed dividends. Becoming impatient of the law's impotence, they determined to use other than legal means. Gould provided the opportunity by deciding to make Erie respectable with a new board of directors of responsible businessmen, among them Junius Morgan, whose firm represented Erie and London. Learning of this plan, the old directors offered themselves for sale to a party representing the English stockholders, the sale put through by payment of $300,000 and Gould ousted. General Daniel Sickles, American minister to Spain on leave of absence to direct the campaign against Gould, received $150,000 for his services in bribing the Erie directors. The whole coup cost $750,000. Degree, Bischofsheim, and Goldschmidt, the London bankers who organized the conspiracy against Gould, secured the English representation of Erie. But old Junius Morgan had his revenge, compelling the payment of $70,000 as the price of giving up a contract for the sale of Erie bonds. Bischofsheim and Goldschmidt recouped themselves for this and the cost of ousting Gould from the proceeds of Erie bond sales. 14. The new management sued J. Gould for restitution of money stolen from Erie, $9 million, and Gould settled for $5 million. The settlement including an agreement that he should be consulted in the working of the road and allowed to buy 200,000 shares of Erie stock at the market price. Gould did this knowing that the news of his settlement would push up the price of Erie stock, upon which he sold his shares. The profit, said Gould, reimbursing me for the money I have paid to Erie. On top of which the securities Gould turned over for the settlement were found to be worth only $200,000. Degree. Out of defeat, as in the Black Friday conspiracy, J. Gould snatched more millions. The transaction impressed British journals as indicating a very unhealthy state of commercial morals, with which the New York Times agreed. 7. J.P. Morgan's victory over J. Gould and Jim Fisk I to the House of Morgan. Press contemporary opinion, which decided that this contest, waged not only by litigation but by force of arms, made Mr. Morgan universally respected as an able financier. 18. This was a new conception of the financier, indicating the trend of the times. Defeating the men who had imposed their will upon Cornelius Vanderbilt and terrorized the business community was an achievement marking the emergence of a dominating personality. The older bankers were either afraid of J. Gould and Jim Fisk, mixed up in their schemes, or pursuing similar schemes of their own. Moreover, they were often too dignified to adopt the rough-and-tumble tactics required under the circumstances. But Morgan was not. He met force with force, guile with guile, methods which Morgan subsequently combined with the technique of using the concentrated power of mass money to conquer his objectives. The combination was irresistible. Chapter 13th, Government Financing, 1870-179. "Collar that dormouse," the Queen shrieked out. "Behead that dormouse. Turn that dormouse out. Suppress him. Pinch him. Off with his whiskers. Alice in Wonderland, J.J. Pierpont Morgan's struggle against Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, revealing the age in Morgan's character, istics, and indicating more important events to come in railroad affairs, was an in. The House of Morgan emerged as a definite American financial power by means of international finance. In a struggle against Jay Cooke, and in the midst of the government financing of 1871 to 79, which refunded $750,000, 0000 of national bonds, the larger part through the House of Morgan. Jay Cooke in 1871 was the dominant American financier, a peculiar combination of Fox and Parson, constructive builder and reckless speculator, patriot and unscrupulous moneymaker, plus some of Barnum's ballyhoo talents. Cooke was a tower of strength to the government in financing the Civil War, his sale of bonds, yielding him commissions of $70, $187. One being facilitated by wily political intrigues, corruption of the press, and securing the confidence of small investors. Other bankers were more of a liability than an asset to the government, often speculating gold and government credit, while Jay Cooke cannily combined profit and loyal service. His almost monopolistic supremacy in the sale of war bonds, which anticipated many modern ideas of popular bond sales in spite of his misleading slogan, "A national debt is a national blessing," aroused enmity in the financial community. 114, the House of Morgan, competitors being mercilessly trod underfoot by Cooke and his. March to power. This enmity was sharpened after the war by the establishment in New York City of a branch house of Jay Cooke and Company, even former friends now becoming rivals. The new company was immediately successful. 2. In 1869, Jay Cooke acquired control of the Northern Pacific Railroad, chartered during the Civil War by speculators without money of their own, and granted 360,000 acres of public lands by Congress. The terms on which the company was reorganized offered prospects of fabulous profits. Cooke and Company agreed to advance Northern Pacific $500,000 and in return received $20 million stock as a bonus, one half of the remaining $60 million stock for introducing and selling $100,000, 0.000 of 7.3% Northern Pacific bonds, and one half of the stock in the Lake Superior and Puget Sound Land Company, organized to exploit the railroad's enormous land grants. As construction proceeded, the balance of $40,000. 0.000 Northern Pacific stock was to be distributed to a pool upon subscribing $5,600,000 cash in stock and bonds. It was a stupendous speculation, affable and benign, as if on the Lord's business. Jay Cooke sweetened members of Congress and other prominent men with Northern Pacific stock and bonds in order to secure their influence with government and public. The company's congressional lobby was stigmatized as a gang of plunderers and beasts of prey. New York and Philadelphia capitalists, excluded from the gigantic speculative enterprise, inspired venomous attacks upon Cooke and the Northern Pacific. One of the most bitter and persistent antagonists was Anthony J. Drexel, soon to become J.P. Morgan's partner. This enmity originated in the Civil War when Drexel and Company, the largest banking house in Philadelphia, were thrust aside in the scramble for government financing business by the new House of Cooke and Company, the congressional demand for an investigation of Jay Cooke civil. War financing was inspired by Drexel, Wallace, Philadelphia. Government financing, 1871 to 79, 115. Ledger maintained an unremitting criticism of Cooke and the Northern Pacific. In order to strengthen his international financial affiliations and dispose of Northern Pacific bonds in Europe, Jay Cooke organized the firm of Cooke, McCulloch and Company. In London, the former Secretary of the Treasury being chosen as a partner partly because his name suggested an alliance with the government, which was likely to impress Europe very much. The new firm could not secure a site near the Bank of England, but were comforted by the consoling thought that they were not farther away from the old lady than Morgans or Barings. Nearly all the London bankers with American affiliations felicitated McCulloch, old Junius Morgan being particularly attentive. But rivalry was sharpened, all the more as the Cookes in London tried to get the profitable American naval agency away from the Barings. The antagonism between Cooke and the other bankers broke out in open conflict in 1871, when the Treasury decided to refund $200,000, 0.000 of Civil War bonds. Expecting to get the business, the Cookes met immediate opposition. Drexel secretly maneuvered against Cooke. Levi P. Morton of Morton, Bliss and Company and his English partner, Sir John Rose, appeared in Washington, tried to get the new loan, and almost succeeded. Congressional agitation assailed the Cookes' power over the government and insisted that the bonds be sold directly by the Treasury, which Secretary Boutwell decided to do. Banking houses in this country and Europe were appointed agents for the loan. Among them, Dabney, Morgan and Company, and J.S. Morgan and Company. The books were opened March 6, 1871, and were to close in 20 days. But most of the bankers in New York City, including Dabney, Morgan and Company, were indifferent to the loan's success, disapproving of direct government sales, and did not act on their appointment as agents. By March 22, only $20 million had been subscribed, one-third being through Cooke and Company, nor were the European bankers. N6, the House of Morgan, sympathetic in their attitude, decided the loan's failure, a total of only $60 million being subscribed. The indifference of the financial community killed the loan. Failure definitely assured Morton, Bliss and Company formed a syndicate in opposition to Cook to get the balance of the loan. The struggle flared up again, but Secretary Boutwell decided on the Cooks, congressional agitation being quiescent. Cook organized two syndicates, one American and the other European. Participation in the European syndicate was offered to the Morgans, Barings and Morton, Rose and Company, but they declined to accept. The syndicate operations were immediately and strikingly successful, $130 million of bonds being disposed of, on which the Cooks cleared $3. 0.0000000 profit. Levi Morton afterward praised the operation, expressing regret that he had rejected the offer to participate because of the belief that a new house, Cook, McCulloch and Company, could not successfully head a foreign syndicate. 10. Capitalizing the advantages of success, Cook, McCulloch and Company secured the American Naval Agency in London. 11. The opposition was temporarily smashed and J. Cook supreme in the American financial world. In June 1871, the Morgans and Drexels combined forces, Charles H. Dabney retiring from Dabney, Morgan and Company, which now became Drexel. Morgan and Company was an important alliance. The Drexels were powerful bankers with excellent foreign connections, which the alliance strengthened, while the Morgans strengthened their American connections. Drexel and Company had dominated the banking field in Philadelphia before the coming of J. Cook, against whom they now prepared more vigorous offensives. The origins of the Drexels were curious. The father, Joseph Drexel, was an immigrant portrait painter who wandered all over Mexico and South America before settling in Philadelphia. There, abandoning art, he made money buying and selling wildcat currency issued by state banks, became a broker dealing in gold from California. Government financing, 1871 to 79, 117, and gradually built up a successful banking business which was inherited by the sons. Drexel, Morgan and Company purchased for $945,000 property in Wall Street on which a chastely dignified building was erected, significant of power and prestige. Contemporary opinions spoke of the great house of the Drexels, but in fact Morgan was the active moving force, although still comparatively unknown beyond the inner circles. The House of Morgan now consisted of Drexel, Morgan and Company, New York, Drexel and Company, Philadelphia, J.S. Morgan and Company, London, and Drexel, Harges and Company, Paris, afterward Morgan, Harges and Company. 1 foot, it was a formidable combination, marking the definite emergence of J. Pierpont Morgan, prepared to dispute with J. Cook for American financial supremacy. Morgan himself directed the new struggle against Cook, which broke out in 1873, again over national financing. As usual, Morgan was in the shadows while other men appeared publicly, but his were the strategy and driving force. Although indisputably the most important contemporary financier, Cook's power was never the financial dictatorship created by Morgan in later years. Personal and institutional characteristics determining the differences. Astute and of extraordinary ability, Cook only partly had the capacity to impose himself on other men and compel their obedience. Under the prevailing conditions of savage competition in finance, where everyone was on the make, the fox might go far, but the quality of the wolf was indispensable to maintain, if not secure, supremacy. Cook never had Morgan's terrifying capacity to bludgeon antagonists into submission. The House of Cook, moreover, concentrated on itself and not on the creation of a system as the basis of its supremacy. Morgan conquered and maintained supremacy not only by his capacity to compel obedience, but by institutionalizing his supremacy in a system of which the House of Morgan was the concentration point, and in which other financiers participated under Morgan's overlordship. When in after years Morgan spoke, "You ate the House of Morgan," he spoke for the system, an order almost automatically obeyed by financiers and their institutions. When Cook spoke, he spoke simply for his house, arousing competitors to hostile combination and action. That happened now, not only competition for new business, but another struggle against J. Cook's supremacy, in which the Cooks recognized young Morgan and Morton as their most active and important rival zone. Morgan, 36 years of age, and Morton, much older but accepting Morgan's leadership. With power, Morgan was beginning to be himself, to manifest the talents of organizing and ruling which were fundamental in his character. His silence, originally considered dull, appeared as the concomitant of power, of temperamental peculiarity, now that Morgan could decide in terms of orders and not discussion, ruling Drexel, Morgan, and Company. He dominated associates, or they ceased being his associates, formerly dependent upon the prestige of J.S. Morgan and Company, buoyed him up while accumulating power, the breath. J. Pierpont Morgan was becoming master in his father S. house, and his own. Aggressively energetic, absorbed in business, no longer the speculative fledgling of the civil A R greater than T rate, and prepared the campaign against J. Cook, whose L.J. was Ln less than indispensable to his own financial supremacy. EAY in 1871, while still flushed with the success of the Sin-Icate operations. The Cooks were afraid of competition, informed Nenebus They suspected the Rothschilds might challenge. own Tiroaturker refunding loans. Kezdir House Rota Cook partner, Wood. D.A. Government financing, 1871 to 79, 119. Labor, their contribution of large sums to the Republican Party in the 1872 campaign, 18 grants our re-election, and the fact of sweetened politicians in Washington being under financial obligations to them convinced the Cooks that they would once secure the new government business. It was a mistake, this dependence upon sweetened politicians who are as unliable as their principals. Morgan never made the mistake, contemptuous of politics and politicians. In spite of this contempt, however, Morgan maintained a general interest in politics of the most reactionary sort, never responding to any progressive principle, and contributing generously to the Republican Party. In 1872, Drexel, Morgan and Company signed a manifesto of bankers and businessmen urging Grant's re-election, in spite of his administration's abysmal incompetence and corruption, for the general welfare of the country, the interests of its trade and commerce, and the consequent stability of its public securities. When the Treasury decided on a new loan in 1873, Jay Cooke was disturbed by the opposition, which immediately appeared and infuriated by Secretary Boutwell's hesitancy in giving his house the business. Morgan organized a syndicate composed of Drexel, Morgan and Company, J.S. Morgan and Company, Baring Bros and Morton Rose and Company, and this syndicate waged war on the Cookes and the Rothschilds. P. Morgan the shadows and Levi Morton the open. The Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives held meetings on the new loan, there being considerable sentiment in Congress for the direct sale of bonds by the Treasury. William B. Duncan, of Duncan, Sherman and Company, appeared before the committee to urge direct government sales, claiming that syndicate operations took United States bonds out of the hands of small investors and put them in the hands of bankers, brokers, and large investors, where they were liable to be affected by the frequent fluctuations in the money market. Whitty Ly Morton, appearing for the Morgan Syndicate. 120, the House of Morgan, ridiculed Duncan's argument and insisted, I do not know of any other method of negotiating a government loan except by bankers. Chairman, you propose to become a member of the next syndicate? Morton, we do. 21. This bland insistence of the Morgan-Morton party for a place in the sun infuriated the Cookes, who were outraged by Secretary Boutwell's procedure of apparently encouraging the opposition. But the opposition campaign was clever. While Cooke asked for the whole business, Morgan and Morton simply insisted on equal participation. Moreover, the opposition developed an annoying political campaign. Morton lobbied publicly and secretly. President Grant was influenced at 22, and a species of political blackmail levied on the government concerning its dependence upon Cooke and Company. There was a collapse of the House of Cards Jay Cooke had built with sweetened politicians. While the Ways and Means Committee declined to recommend any action on the loan, Secretary Boutwell decided to compromise, dividing the $300,000. 0,000 of bonds equally between the Morgan-Morton Syndicate, including J.S. Morgan and Company and the Barings, and the Cooke Syndicate, including the Rothschilds, 28. The compromise was a Morgan victory, as his syndicate had simply insisted on equal participation, which was granted. A victory achieved by exploiting the general distrust and fear of Jay Cooke and by mobilizing the Morgan's international financial power. Most of the loan was to be placed in Europe, and the formidable combination of J.S. Morgan and Company, the Barings and Drexel, Harges and Company, offset the Rothschilds' support of Cooke. But the victory was equally important in the struggle for American financial supremacy. Operations to dispose of the loan in the United States were directed by Morgan, Morton, and Fanistock, a Cooke partner. In advertisements to the American public signed J. Government financing, 1871 to 79, 121. Cooke and Company. Drexel, Morgan and Company, and Morton, Bliss and Company, the syndicate emphasized its connections in Europe and America, which ensure the placing of the entire remainder of 5% bonds. Prospective buyers were urged to act immediately, as it is expected that the affiliations in Europe will be very large, and perhaps more than sufficient to absorb the whole loan. 24 books were opened on February 4, and the next day Junius Morgan sent a cable of confident tenor, 25. But something went wrong. Perhaps the antagonists could not work smoothly together. More important, business was unsound, money tight, underlying conditions preparing the panic that was to break loose within a few months. Subscriptions were meager. By February 16th, only $13,500,000 had been subscribed in the United States and a few millions in Europe. Fright assailed the syndicate members, and they implored Secretary Boutwell not to issue the call for $100 million on February 9th, but to postpone Action 27. Upon definite news of the loan's failure in London, speculators forced up the price of gold 2 feet. The Cooke party spoke sarcastically of their distinguished associates, and Jay Cooke hoped they would back out, considering them a hindrance rather than a help. 2. But Morgan and Morton did not back out, and the bond operations limped on their way. Then the syndicate called upon Secretary Boutwell to scale down the call to $50 million, which was done. In spite of the loan's failure, Morgan had conquered a measure of financial equality with Cooke, whose prestige was severely lowered and whose house was to disappear in the Great Panic of 1873. In 1873, J. Pierpont Morgan received the accolade of membership in the Union League Club. Organized to sustain Abraham Lincoln in the prosecution of the war, the Union League Club, from the start, proposed to organize the delight of the slight in the new money aristocracy coming to power, an inner circle of the powerful to influence legislation and social life generally. The club sought its members among three classes: 1. Men of substance and established high positions socially; 2. Clever men, especially of letters, wits, and artists who have made their mark; and 3. Promising young men who... 122. The House of Morgan. General uneasiness preceded the panic, tight money, developing industrial recession, and a dangerously top-heavy financial superstructure reared upon unrestrained speculation, particularly in railroads and land. The collapse of railroad speculation precipitated the panic. In September, second brokerage houses failed in New York City, with one of which Daniel Drew was identified, 31. Then the New York branch of Cook and Company suspended, without consulting J. Cook, compelling suspension of the parent branch in Philadelphia. The panic spread like wildfire, there being 40 important suspensions in 2 days in New York City alone, 32. Cook and Company crashed owing largely to their enormous burden of practically useless Northern Pacific collateral acquired in the course of unsound speculative manipulations. Sales of Northern Pacific bonds calculated upon to sustain the whole speculate. Ion had slackened and almost ceased because of public distrust produced by revelations of how the Credit Mobilier had plundered the Union Pacific and smeared corruption over the national government. But J. Cook was determined to proceed with the Northern Pacific, being in too deep to retire, and made still larger advances to the company. While the immense speculation in land by the Lake Superior and Puget Sound Land Company still further sapped Northern Pacific's resources and hastened its insolvency. 34. J. Cook specialized successfully in securing the confidence of small investors, and these were now victims of the crash. One was a poor old woman who holds a $500 Northern Pacific bond, all her earthly wealth. Another, wrote the financier, I worked 20 years to get that little sum of $360. Should be drawn in and nourished with care, but especially those rich young men who don't understand what their place can be in American society. In 1864, the Union League Club adopted resolutions in favor of immigrant contract labor, the establishment of agencies through which the various classes of employers may obtain the particular operatives they require. Henry W. Bellows' Historical Sketch of the Union League Club of New York, 1863-79, pp. 1365. Government Financing, 1871-79, 123. Together. You told me and my little girl when we went to the bank to get our money that all was safe. These letters, according to J. Cook's biographer, of the most pitiful kind, were calculated to increase Mr. Cook's mortification. 38. The crash was complete and final. 5 years of business depression followed the 1873 panic, accompanied by agrarian distress, severe unemployment, wage reductions, and an upflare of social discontent. Mercantile failures involved immense losses. 88. The Granger movement assumed new vigor in its expression of agrarian discontent, while the Greenback Party proposed cheap money legislation and in 1878 secured substantial representation in Congress. Labor burst forth in the great strikes of 1877, which were stigmatized as revolutionary. Discontent, as usual, developed attacks upon the banks, and bankers in convention assembled expressed grave apprehensions as to the future of the banking system in the United States. Popular hostility toward the banks has probably never been so widespread. 87. The combined farmer-labor revolt frightened industrialists, financiers, and politicians. Mild reform proposals were savagely rejected, strikes ruthlessly crushed, and unemployed demonstrations dispersed by force. Its liberal principles cracking under the strain, the nation insinuated that farmers were thieves and swindlers in demanding lower freight rates, which meant carrying their grain for a trifle. 38. Henry Ward Beecher, himself the recipient of $20,000 a year, and whose church had been organized as a profit-making enterprise by real estate speculators, sermonized against labor amid the applause of Plymouth's congregation. Is the great working class oppressed? Yes, undoubtedly it is. God has intended the great to be great and the little to be little. The trade union originated after his discharge from bankruptcy. J. Cook invested $3,000 in a silver mine against the advice of his friends. The mine proved fabulously rich, and in 1879 Cook sold his share for $1 million, assuring a comfortable old age. E.P. Oberholzer, J. Cook, Vol. 2, pp. 522. Government Financing, 1871-79, 125. For unlimited coinage of silver would prevent further sales of bonds. 4. Depression and discontent strengthened the movement for cheap money. The Greenback Party, with 14 members in Congress, was making alarming progress in its agitation for payment of the national debt in greenbacks and repeal of the Resumption Act, a program accepted by a newly organized labor party, the National Party. Social as well as financial issues were involved. Redemption of Civil War bonds in gold meant increasing the principal's value by 35%, 48. As after the revolution, redemption of the worthless paper currency enriched a clique of speculators, including Robert Morris and Governor George Clinton. So the resumption of specie payments enriched a small group of bondholders, while depression oppressed the people. Labor and the farmers, moreover, felt that cheap money would end depression, while the farmers' mortgage burdens would be eased and agricultural prices increased. As against this, bankers wanted a gold currency to ensure financial stability and the bondholders to increase the value of their bonds. It was a triangular class struggle in which economic facts overwhelmed labor and the agrarians, scoring another inevitable conquest for a business enterprise. Secretary Sherman, however, in 1878 again proceeded with his resumption plans, in spite of congressional and popular opposition. The Morgan Rothschild Syndicate secured an issue of $50 million 4% bonds payable in gold coin or bullion for resumption purposes. 4. Attacks on the loan and resumption flared up again, particularly in the West, but on January 1, 1879, specie payment was resumed. 48. Resumption had been preceded by a steady rise in the value of greenback currency and prepared for by the Treasury's accumulation of gold, but its success was still doubtful. In March, foreign bankers unanimously predicted that gold would again move to Europe and threaten resumption. 44. Secretary Sherman met this by an issue of $25 million 4%. Government financing, 1871 to 79, 125. For unlimited coinage of silver would prevent further sales of bonds. Depression and discontent strengthened the movement for cheap money. The Greenback Party, with 14 members in Congress, was making alarming progress in its agitation for payment of the national debt in greenbacks and repeal of the Resumption Act, a program accepted by a newly organized Labor Party, the National Party. Social as well as financial issues were involved. Redemption of Civil War bonds in gold meant increasing the principal's value by 35%. 4 feet. As after the revolution, redemption of the worthless paper currency enriched a clique of speculators, including Robert Morris and Governor George Clinton. So the resumption of specie payments enriched a small group of bondholders, while depression oppressed the people. Labor and the farmers, moreover, felt that cheap money would end depression, while the farmers' mortgage burdens would be eased and agricultural prices increased. As against this, bankers wanted a gold currency to ensure financial stability and the bondholders to increase the value of their bonds. It was a triangular class struggle in which economic facts overwhelmed labor and the agrarians, scoring another inevitable conquest for a business enterprise. Secretary Sherman, however, in 1878 again proceeded with his resumption plans, in spite of congressional and popular opposition. The Morgan Rothschild Syndicate secured an issue of $50 million for J4% bonds payable in gold coin or bullion for resumption purposes. Attacks on the loan and resumption flared up again, particularly in the West, but on January 1, 1879, specie payment was resumed. 4 feet. Resumption had been preceded by a steady rise in the value of greenback currency and prepared for by the Treasury's accumulation of gold, but its success was still doubtful. In March, foreign bankers unanimously predicted that gold would again move to Europe and threaten resumption. 4 feet. Secretary Sherman met this by an issue of $25 million 4%. I-6. Bonds sold in London by the Rothschild Morgan Syndicate in order to prevent the shipment of gold from this country to Europe. 110. But the situation remained unfavorable, and the Commercial and Financial Chronicle asked, "Where is the prosperity promised with resumption?" 61. At this juncture, an immense grain shortage in Europe created an increased demand and higher prices for American wheat, stimulating the largest grain exports in our history. Agricultural prosperity accelerated industrial revival and general business prosperity. The situation, moreover, favored resumption owing to Europe being compelled to pay for its grain imports in gold. During 3 months in 1879, Europe sent large shipments of gold to the United States, averting the danger of Europe draining away American gold. Resumption was assured by the grain crop of 1879 and the large exports of the next 2 years. 62. Agitation for cheap money declined owing to farmers receiving higher prices for their products, the object aimed at by the inflationary greenback proposals. In the refunding operations, the financial community was not enthusiastic in its offers and pressed the Treasury for concessions. Secretary Sherman was compelled to revise one contract, and in the resumption loan of 1878, the terms offered 50 nominal banks were unacceptable, the Morgan Rothschild Syndicate offering more favorable terms. 63. The struggle. Power among the bankers, however, resulted in better MST and might otherwise have been secured. I knew of the TLRV, SHT, ULIS, then EB7, THT banks and bankers, said Sikrian 3 and LC Tetsin, Syndicate and prominent OT Ange W0 participate new Cindy Exudo, EL0, USLN to Czech. Other. 66. The 1877 Operation Sinless Thankates 8 REIT profits were made in the vantage by many police. Secretary Sherman secured the adoff each other. Financiers distrust and jealousy. Financial competition still PRC veiled. 5th Sen Yevsit, The House of Morgan. Government financing. 1871 to 79, 127. Was another story. J. Pierpont Morgan dominating the financial system and largely imposing his terms upon the government. But in 1877, Morgan's supreme power was still to come, and journals described the refunding syndicate as the Belmont Syndicate after August Belmont, the American representative of the House of Rothschild. The Morgans, however, participated in the syndicate as equals of the Rothschilds, then the most powerful banking house in the world, and the alliance emphasized the fact that Drexel Morgan and Company now occupied the place of the House of Cook, formerly the Rothschilds' American ally. By 1879, the House of Morgan had definitely emerged as a dominant power in American finance, largely through its international financial affiliations and operations. 126. Bonds sold in London by the Rothschild Morgan Syndicate in order to prevent the shipment of gold from this country to Europe are 50. But the situation remained unfavorable, and the Commercial and Financial Chronicle asked, "Where is the prosperity promise with resumption?" 51. At this juncture, an immense grain shortage in Europe created an increased demand and higher prices for American wheat, stimulating the largest grain exports in our history. Agricultural prosperity accelerated industrial revival and general business prosperity. The situation, moreover, favored resumption owing to Europe being compelled to pay for its grain imports in gold. During 3 months in 1879, Europe sent large shipments of gold to the United States, averting the danger of Europe draining away American gold. Resumption was assured by the grain crop of 1879 and the large exports of the next 2 years. 52. Agitation for cheap money declined owing to farmers receiving higher prices for their products, the object aimed at by the inflationary greenback proposals. In the refunding operations, the financial community was not enthusiastic in its offers and pressed the Treasury for concessions. Secretary Sherman was compelled to revise one contract, and in the resumption loan of 1878, the terms offered by the national banks were unacceptable. The Morgan Rothschild Syndicate offering more favorable terms. 53. The struggle for power among the bankers, however, resulted in better terms than might otherwise have been secured. "I knew of the sensitive jealousy between the banks and bankers," said Secretary Sherman, "and between the old syndicate and prominent and wealthy firms who wished to participate in any new syndicate, and were jealous and suspicious of each other." The Rothschild Morgan Syndicate's great profits were made in the 1877 operation. But later, Secretary Sherman secured the advantage by manipulating the financiers' distrust and jealousy of each other. Financial competition still prevailed. 15 years later, the House of Morgan. Government financing. 1871 to 79, 127. Was another story. J. Pierpont Morgan dominating the financial system and largely imposing his terms upon the government. But in 1877, Morgan's supreme power was still to come, and journals described the refunding syndicate as the Belmont Syndicate after August Belmont, the American representative of the House of Rothschild. 8. The Morgans, however, participated in the syndicate as equals of the Rothschilds, then the most powerful banking house in the world, and the alliance emphasized the fact that Drexel Morgan and Company now occupy the place of the House of Cook, formerly the Rothschilds' American ally. By 1879, the House of Morgan had definitely emerged as a dominant power in American finance, largely through its international financial affiliations and operations. Part 4. Morganizing Railroads. Chapter 5. Financiers. Old and new. When you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will someday, and then after that into a butterfly, I should think you'll feel it a little queer, won't you? Not a bit, said the caterpillar. Alice in Indiana Wonderland. In the decade 1879 to 89, the House of Morgan consolidated its financial power and developed the institutionalized mechanism for the control of investment resources and of industry which distinguished its subsequent development. The Morgans' financial power manifested itself in the 1884 panic when their intervention was asked to restore confidence. Preceded and accompanied by depression in trade and industry, severe unemployment, and tight money, the panic produced many bank failures and a stock market crash. In the midst of the panic, Cyrus W. Field, the first transatlantic cables projector and promoter, sent a cable to Junius Morgan urging action by his house to restore stock market confidence. Many of our businessmen seem to have lost their heads. What we want is some cool-headed strongman to lead. If you should form a syndicate in London to buy through Drexel, Morgan and Company good securities in this market, I believe you would make a great deal of money and at the same time entirely change the feeling here. Canny old Junius Morgan had made large purchases to great advantage, which he considered beneficial to the stock market, but did not think a syndicate desirable or necessary. 2. The circumstances were unfavorable and the stock market. I-32, the House of Morgan, kept shifted for itself. Field's proposal, however, indicated the contemporary feeling of the financial community and its recognition of the Morgans' leadership, a leadership expressed by the House of Morgan in other stock market crashes, particularly in 1907 and 1929. In 1889, the Morgans' financial power manifested itself in another and more characteristic way. J.P. Morgan had secured control of many important railroads, combining financial power and direct railroad power in a fashion new to American finance. Control of Northern Pacific by J. Cook and Company was an isolated speculative enterprise, not much different from similar enterprises except that Cook was a banker, while the Goulds and Vanderbilts were essentially entrepreneurs manipulating railroads. Morgan's railroad empire, on the contrary, was the direct product of developing finance assuming new forms and functions. In 1889, the House of Morgan convened a conference of railroad presidents, at which Morgan presided and issued ultimatums. Bankers triumph and presidents surrender, declared the New York Times. 2. Morganization, the control of finance over industry, and consequently the centralization of industry and finance, made its definite appearance. In 1879, the House of Morgan was essentially an old-style financial institution, dealing in foreign exchange, placing American securities in Europe, gathering together the scattered capital of innumerable investors by selling stocks and bonds and participating in government financing. By 1889, the House of Morgan still did all these things, but in addition, it participated directly in corporate affairs, combining, consolidating, centralizing, imposing the mastery of finance over industry by the institutionalized control of investment resources and of corporate industry itself. The empire J. Pierpont Morgan carved out of American industry is often interpreted in terms of the man's personality. Clearly his truculent and domineering character animated by financiers, old and new 133, an overwhelming urge to power, could not satisfy itself with the traditional function of the investment banker as an intermediary between corporate enterprise and the investor, where it might control corporate enterprise. But the form of expression of Morgan's will to power, the technique of that power, was determined by forces more decisive than personality, by the complex of new industrial and financial relations, of class forces and class power, of the revolutionary transformation of American economic life. Morgan was by inclination and circumstances a banker and a conservative banker, his conservatism projecting itself financially, politically, and socially. J. Cook might pioneer railroads through the wilderness and others create an industry out of a dream, but either was repugnant to Morgan. This sound conservative banker consolidated enterprises, never pioneered them. Yet Morgan was to personify the revolution which transformed the financier from an agent of industry into its master. Sound conservative banking means an adjustment to facts, the practical facts of prevailing business procedure. As business changes, banking must change, otherwise it becomes unsound. A change here, an adjustment there, never beyond the limits of immediate needs and profit. In this accretive fashion, organization shaped its technique. The immediate task, seldom the far-flung objective, absorbed Morgan at once the strength and weakness of the man. Concentrating upon immediate tasks determined by the dynamic problems and changes of American business enterprise, Morgan moved unimaginatively, massively, but irresistibly, with the irresistibility of economic compulsion to the Morganization of industry by means of new financial procedure and institutions, imposing the control of the financier over industry and integrating industry and finance. Before the Civil War, industry operated overwhelmingly in small units under control of individuals or partnerships. 134. People directly interested in an enterprise subscribed the capital, seldom large, and usually participated both in ownership and management. The bank's functions were almost exclusively commercial, financing the mercantile movement of the products of industry. The merchant capitalist was the dominant entrepreneurial factor. As industry developed, the industrial capitalist superseded the merchant capitalists in importance. But although originally organized by industrial capitalists, the corporation assumed such large dimensions and required such large amounts of capital that it thrust the industrial capitalist into the background, or made him dependent upon stockholders and financiers. As corporate industry consolidated and combined, becoming still larger, the financial capitalists became the most important factor in business enterprise. These changes produced a system of complex financial relations and institutions, multiplying and modifying the banks, developing other financial institutions, and creating a new type of financier, changes which, while appearing before the Civil War, acquired maturity during the period 1870 to 1900s, where commercial banks, as their name implies, originally simply provided the money to finance the movement of goods from producer to consumer. They now finance industrial corporations to produce goods by making loans for working capital and by purchasing corporate bonds. These banks, moreover, participated in the business of investment houses by means of loans on new corporate issues pending their absorption by the investing public, and often directly engaged in promotions. The banks combined their old commercial functions with general investment operations. The financial changes produced by corporate enterprise developed the trust company. Combining commercial and direct investment banking of all sorts, trust companies acted as fiscal agents of corporations, registrars, and custodians of securities, depositaries under reorganization agreements, and another. The House of Morgan. Financiers, old and new 135. Ways served corporate enterprise and paralleled its development, both growing rapidly and simultaneously after 1880. As insurance companies grew in size and resources, they also became important factors in financing corporate business enterprise, being immense reservoirs of investment capital. These developments enlarged the scope and power of investment bankers. Before the Civil War, investment houses engaged primarily in securing foreign capital, as in the case of Peabody and Company, and in financing canals, railroads, and other large-scale enterprises. As corporate enterprise began to dominate business, investment banking assumed larger importance. Industry concentrated, requiring more capital, which was gathered up by banks and investment houses and placed at the disposal of large-scale enterprise. The multiplication of stockholders separated corporate ownership and management. Corporations grew larger. Stockholders were deprived of all functional participation in industry beyond the initial act of investment, simply receiving the income on their securities. The trust company, acting as trustee for individuals and estates and serving as investment expert for investors, assuming all investment responsibility, emphasized the separation of corporate ownership and management, since the investor now did not even choose his investments. This increasingly large class of non-managing investors provided most of the capital required by corporate enterprise, where this capital was not accumulated by reinvestment of profits. One of the first consequences of the separation of ownership and management was usurpation of control by the buccaneers, who manipulated and plundered the property of scattered stockholders. Competitive skullduggery aggravated the situation. Corporate enterprises began to combine to strengthen their competitive position, simultaneously strengthening the buccaneers' opportunity for plunder. Buccaneering and ruthless competition created business disturbances, lowered the 136th the House of Morgan general level of profits, and upset the complex relations of corporate business. Stabilization was necessary. Industrial concentration and combination produced measurable stabilization. But then arose the problem of stabilization among the combinations whose unrestrained competition was more disastrous than among petty enterprises. The separation of ownership and management, which gave the buccaneers the opportunity to plunder, now gave the bankers the opportunity to intervene and usurp control. While financiers often engaged in buccaneering practices, finance itself was a stabilizing force, compelled to emphasize the constructive aspects of the new economic order. Banks, and particularly investment bankers, who originally acted almost exclusively as intermediaries between corporations and investors by the sale of securities, now participated actively in corporate management, determined the personnel and larger policy of boards of directors, created community of interest and TO operation among combinations, and imposed financial control over corporate business. Financial concentration accompanied industrial concentration. Larger industrial units required larger banking units. Banks amassed larger resources, consolidated and combined. Investment bankers acquired control of banks and other financial institutions and their investment resources, combining control of the sources of money and of the corporate users of money, centralizing industry and finance. Out of this amalgamation of functions and institutions arose the power of the new-style financiers, particularly of the House of Morgan. This interlocking of industry and finance constituted the fundamental aspect of Morganization of the financial pinnae. Buccaneering practices were, in general, also determined by unprincipled competition, by the predatory aspects of capitalism. There was no separation of ownership and management in Standard Oil, owned at the time by a small clique of stockholders. Yet Rockefeller's enterprise was extremely piratical. There was this important difference. Rockefeller plundered competitors and the public, not his own enterprise, while the buccaneers plundered as well enterprises under their control. Financiers, old and new. Tration and control of industry. There was another important aspect. The complexity of modern industry demands centralization, a measure of unified regulation and control over economic life. Ruthless, unrestrained competition disorganizes and demoralizes. Corporate combinations introduced measurable unity in their particular industry, but often clashed with each other. Morganization emphasized community interest among corporations and the masters of corporations, appearing as a force acting against the worst buccaneer practices and the business disturbances provoked by economic civil war. This was a phase of the larger problem of regulation and control which society in the shape of its government declined to act upon, and which was usurped by the investment bankers by Morganization. Of all investment bankers, J. Pierpont Morgan most clearly recognized the importance of the new developments and most thoroughly acted in accordance with that recognition. Still, other bankers, particularly James Stillman and George F. Baker, participated in the development of an institutionalized mechanism for the control of investment resources and of corporate industry, an inevitable financial development of concentrated capitalism. Morgan secured supreme power owing to peculiar temperamental characteristics. The centralization of industry and finance during 1870 to 1900s constituted a transition period, and transitions offer an opportunity for dictatorships. Relationships which subsequently become completely institutionalized function during their development in the transition period, largely through personal expression and compulsion. The system of financial centralization and control institutionally expressed itself in the dominance of the House of Morgan, but equally through the personal ascendancy and dictatorship of Morgan himself. His overwhelming impulse to dominate other men to rule, and the capacity to get his rulership accepted, was a decisive factor in his own ascendancy and the supremacy of the House of 137, 138, the House of Morgan. Morgan. It was not enough to develop the new financial technique. Morgan had to engage in a tooth and claw struggle with antagonists, with men in his own camp to browbeat, impose, and dominate. The arrogant self-confidence, the aggressive personality, the streak of ferocity which terrorized lesser men, all were important in Morgan's emergence to power out of savage economic civil war. To Morgan, power meant dictatorship. He knew no other way to rule. He disposed of men, money, and property in the same brusque fashion, compelling obedience, savagely breaking down resistance. While developing his dictatorship over railroads, the president of one road approached Morgan to protest against an ultimatum. President, you can't ask us to turn over our whole road to you. Morgan, your roads belong to my clients, which meant, your roads belong to me. I shall do what I consider necessary, issue the orders, and you must obey. Morgan inspired fear, overwhelming fear, and unquestioning obedience, but he also inspired confidence and loyalty. Self-confident, massively solid, one knew where he stood, a quality particularly important in transitions when changes are frequent and bewildering. A man always has two reasons, said Morgan, for the things he does, a good one and the real one. Morgan seldom gave the good reason for what he did either to himself or to others, but frankly gave the real one a quality of cynical arrogance perhaps, but also of honest realism. Such a man never indulges in daydreams, or envisages far-flung objectives, or permits imagination to pioneer the originality which may be dangerous. Morgan was not original nor of pioneer temperament, but the practical organizer and ruler, moving irresistibly to supreme financial power. Chapter 15, Railroad Demoralization. The players all played at once, quarreling all the while and fighting for the hedgehogs, and in a very short time the queen was in a furious passion, and went stamping about and shouting off with his heddle. Alice in Wonderland. The buccaneer practices of Jay Gould and Jim Frisk provided J.P. Morgan's first opportunity to participate directly in railroad affairs, but outside of the struggle for control of. The Albany and Susquehanna Morgan, up to 1879, had scarcely departed from the old-style investment banker's limited function of selling stocks and bonds. In 1879, the House of Morgan emerged as a railroad power by means of a transaction involving William H. Vanderbilt and the sale of New York Central stock in England, a transaction determined by Morgan's international affiliations and linked up with important aspects of the movement centralizing industry and finance. Upon the old Commodore's death, William H. Vanderbilt inherited the New York Central system, a railroad empire in itself. Cornelius Vanderbilt had done an important constructive job of railroad consolidation, New York Central becoming one of the most efficient systems in the country. But in his onward sweep to empire, the old Commodore had corrupted legislatures, ruthlessly crushed competition, and provoked enormous public antagonisms. Enmity against the New York Central was all the sharper because of the large dividends paid on stock, 40% of which was water Dodd. William H. Vanderbilt inherited the antagonisms provoked by his father and him. The House of Morgan. Self-provoked new antagonisms, morose, unimaginative, parsimonious, contemptuously disliked by his own father. The younger Vanderbilt had neither the force nor the engaging piratical flair which made people like Cornelius Vanderbilt while infuriated by his actions. Public hostility broke loose unrestrainedly in the press, legislature, and municipal councils, Vanderbilt being denounced as a dangerous monopolist and often threatened with blackmail by corrupt politicians. This hostility was intensified by Vanderbilt's stupidly arrogant attitude of the public be damned. The New York legislature threatened to impose heavy taxation upon the central system, in which Vanderbilt owned 87% of the stock. While the state's investigation of the railroads revealed many damaging facts, particularly New York Central's connection with John D. Rockefeller's use of secret discriminatory rates, rebates, and drawbacks to crush competitors. 3. Commodore Vanderbilt would have fought tigerishly back, but the sun scurried to cover. Vanderbilt discussed the situation with Morgan, to whom capitalists now went with large propositions. Two issues were involved. Vanderbilt wanted to scatter some of his stock to avoid the cry of monopolist, and to prevent a threatened competitive war between New York Central and the Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific Railroad, in which Morgan was interested. The decision was to sell $25 million of Vanderbilt stock in England and conclude a Central Wabash alliance, accomplishing 4 purposes. Prevent the threatened rupture between Wabash and the Central. The new stockholders, being English, secured an important influence hampering possible hostile legislative action. Increasing the number of stockholders in general helped break down the monopolist one-man ownership argument. Concentration of ownership has hitherto exposed the New York Central to many attacks, said the Railway World, and Railroad demoralization 141. The diffusion of its stock will lessen the number of its enemies and increase the number of its influential friends. As diffusion of stock ownership increased, it created a class of small stockholders which, while still a small minority of the American people, was sufficiently influential to blunt public hostility to corporate enterprise. Finally, as the New York Central developed from a railroad of 700 miles into an infinitely larger system, one-man ownership was impossible. Corporate concentration transformed the managing industrial capitalist into the absentee financial capitalist. The sales scattered some of Vanderbilt's holdings, securing diversity of investment and safety, the important final development being that diversification, emphasizing the separation of ownership and management, facilitated the introduction of financial control over industry. Morgan insisted as a condition of the stock sale that his house receive representation on Central's board of directors, which would have infuriated the Commodore. But Vanderbilt yielded, reluctantly. Morgan's demand expressed the drift toward more direct banking participation in corporate industry. The utmost secrecy prevailed in the discussions between Morgan and Vanderbilt. Reports of the contemplated sale were acrimoniously discussed in Wall Street as dishonorable stock jobbing rumors, no one believing that Vanderbilt would sell. Confirmation of the sale, which astonished the market, was characterized as one of the most remarkable railroad transactions. Drexel, Morgan and Company organized a syndicate including J.S. Morgan and Company, August Belmont and Company, Morton Bliss and Company, and Jay Gould, Morgan being head of syndicate and always, from now on. Vanderbilt stock was easily sold in England, a tribute to the international financial dominance of the House of Morgan. The Morgan Syndicate bought the stock at $120 and sold at $130, realizing a profit of $3,000. 0000. J.S. Morgan and Company became general agents of New York Central and London. Morgan himself was elected to the board of direct. 142. The House of Morgan. Torrs, representing the New English stockholders, and Drexel Morgan and Company secured the fiscal agency of the Vanderbilt Railroad system. Concluding an alliance, Wabash secured 2 directors on the New York Central Board and an outlet to the Atlantic, while Central secured southwestern traffic under Wabash control. In 1883, Wabash was leased to the Missouri and Pacific Railroad of the Jay Gould System. 8. In addition, Drexel, Morgan and Company were fiscal agents of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The House of Morgan emerged as a railroad power, interlocking railroad systems by means of financial penetration. The larger aspects of the New York Central transaction were recognized by the Commercial and Financial Chronicle, which said, "This new combination clearly has for its ultimate aim a union under one head of the system of roads from New York to the Great Northwest, and then on to San Francisco." The importance of the stock sale as a phase of the combination movement determined Morgan to participate aggressively in railroad affairs. Out of this participation developed the Morganization of the railroads as an expression of the new technique of financial centralization and control. In the background of Morgan's decision as an immediate practical problem was the demoralization prevailing among the railroads, depressing investment values, and producing widespread discontent. The demoralization was particularly acute during the years 1870-89, the situation being aptly characterized by Charles Francis Adams, then president of the Union Pacific Railroad. Stockholders are complaining. Directors are bewildered. Bankers are frightened. The railroad system, especially IB regions west of Chicago, is today managed on principles which must inevitably lead to financial DI. Saster. The dishonest methods of rate cutting, the secret system of rebates, the indirect and hidden payments made to influence the course of traffic resorted to or devised in the last 2Y. Railroad demoralization, precedented in the whole bad record of the past there, is an utter disregard of fundamental ideals of truth, fair play, and fair dealing. 10. Demoralization among the railroads was a direct consequence of their whole history, a fascinating mixture of magnificent enterprise and downright thievery, of the absence of unified national transportation plans, and of the contemporary insistence that competition should prevail in an industry where competition was particularly bad. American railroads up to 1880 were largely built with public money. Federal, state, and municipal governments contributed $700 million for railroad construction and grants of 155,000. 0,000 acres of public lands, an empire of 242,000 square miles, larger than France and 4 times the size of New England. About 40% of the legitimate construction costs were paid by public money. 11. If profits on the sales of land received from the government are added, the whole cost was borne by the people in the shape of government aid. This undoubtedly facilitated railroad construction, but it also encouraged speculation and plunder. For government aid was accompanied by complete independence of the railroads from government control, on the theory of private competitive business enterprise. That benevolent old uncle, the government, should come across financially but must not interfere. Under the prevailing conditions of lack of government control, very loose corporation laws, unrestricted competition and speculation, political corruption, and low business morals, thievery and demoralization inevitably developed among the railroads. Plundering usually started with securing government aid by bribery, railroad promoters smearing a dirty trail of corruption over legislatures. Where bribes were not forthcoming, legislators often blackmailed bribes by threats of preventing favorable or initiating hostile action. Business plundered the government, and politics plundered business. Most of the railroad promoters were flagrant speculators with little money. 143, 144. Of their own, money being raised by selling bonds to the public, often at heavy discounts, disastrously piling up fixed charges. Promoters appropriated most of the stock as bonus, cash subscriptions from stock seldom exceeding 30% of the railroad's construction costs, and frequently almost nothing. 13. Land grants were another source of speculative profit for promoters and directors. Still another means of making illegitimate profit was construction of the railroad, usually undertaken by promoters and directors organized in a separate construction company, charging enormously high prices. The most scandalous construction frauds were those of the Credit Mobilier, which charged the Union Pacific $93,546. 0000 for construction against the legitimate cost of $50,000. 0000. The Credit Mobilier organizers being the promoters of Union Pacific, which received money and public lands from the federal government. 1. Every mile of Western railroads cost 35% to 50% more than legitimate construction costs. The railroads were marvels equally of engineering enterprise and speculative plunder. But that was not all. After their construction, the railroads came under control of buccaneers. The plunder of Erie Annual Drew, Jay Gould, and Jim Fisk was characteristic, as Jay struggled for control of the Albany and Susquehanna-Wanroa, in which J.P. Morgan beat back the buccaneer offensive. Buccaneers disregarded business and the public. Sealgun Y asked, who can measure the iniquity? None 131 way Rexers W10 hectares ve used their power for nefari for posageton franchises, cheated their stockholders. ITVA K105, power foof and beneficent instrumentality ever placed at the disposal of man, mented FA4 buoners the railroads were further torcanering. Roads wage on WJIH, seeing courage Bilastamp. Nessa Redrin ate on each other for new bustle financially, and Throxgoff moralizing the 8 RNNEOT them into bankruptcy. Nor, the House of Morgan, railroad demoralization, did rate wars materially help the public since lower rates in. One case were offset by higher rates in others, while discriminatory rates flourished. Railroads tried to regulate rates by pooling agreements, but these were illegal, and there were always railroad managements precipitating rate wars by breaking agreements. The threat of a rupture of peaceful relations between New York Central and the Wabash was one cause of the Morgan-Vanderbilt transaction in Central Stock. Consolidation measurably regulated competition and rates, but it was opposed by public opinion, and railroads waged rate wars in spite of consolidation. Demoralization made investment in railroads unsafe and unprofitable. The buccaneers plundered investors as much as they plundered business and the public. In spite of most railroad bonds offering 7%, the average interest in 1886 was 4.7%. While the average yield on stock was only 2%, including watered stock, 16. In 1876 railroad, bonds in default represented 39% of the total. And in 1879, 65 roads capitalized at $234 million were sold under foreclosure. 1 year later, bankrupt railroads represented 20% of total mileage and capitalization. 18. The business depression of 1873 to 79 was only in part responsible for the financial demoralization. In the ensuing period of prosperity, the situation grew worse instead of better. Disgruntled railroad investors demoralized the general investment market, a development directly concerning the House of Morgan in its investment banking operations. Railroad demoralization, moreover, inflicted heavy losses on foreign investors, many of whom had purchased their securities through the Morgans. Foreign investors owned $251 million of railroad bonds in default. 10. The Bankers magazine estimated that between 1873 and 1879, European investors in American enterprises had lost $600, 0.000000 by bankruptcy or fraud, and declared that this despoiling of European investors has been going on for more than a generation. 20 in Germany 145, 146. Financier declared, an American railroad bond could not be sold even if signed by an angel. In England, the status said, the consequences of rate wars on American railways are proving so disastrous to the holders of securities, and the prospects are so gloomy that some heroic remedy must be resorted to, else the whole investment will be lost. 22. This situation directly threatened the House of Morgan, the power of which still depended upon its international financial affiliations and the import of capital by the United States. Moved largely by the immediate practical problem of restoring foreign confidence in American securities, J. Pierpont Morgan decided to intervene more actively in railroads. The intervention was to have other and more important consequences than the original purpose. The House of Morgan, Chapter TI, Reorganizing Railroads. She noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat." Alice, Indiana Wonderland. The House of Morgan's penetration of the railroads developed by reorganization of bankrupt roads, out of which arose the Morganized system of financial centralization and control. In developing the new system, J. Pierpont Morgan moved from the particular to the general. The general policy being shaped slowly out of the particular problems and tasks imposed upon the financier by railroad demoralization, bankruptcy, and reorganization in terms of stabilized finances, profits, and investment banking operations. These railroad reorganizations revealed the essential Morgan quality, constructive force, an acute sense of financial values, ruthless determination in pursuing objectives, never abandoning the practical, and the spirit of dictatorship in imposing his will upon other men. When Morgan reorganized a railroad, he told the managers bluntly, almost brutally, "The road now belongs to me." Some growled, others admired, all obeyed, and admitted he got things done. An increase in demoralization and bankruptcy, particularly by the promotion of blackmail railroads, facilitated the Morgan penetration. In 1880 to 82, there was an addition of 34% to the country's railroad mileage, of which not more than one-third was justified by existing business at one. Some of the new railroads, 148, anticipated future needs, others were built to strengthen the power of large consolidated roads, and still others simply to make money for the promoters. Competition sharpened, rate wars multiplied, earnings declined, and bankruptcy flourished. The prevailing demoralization was made still worse by the fact that many of the new railroads were blackmail enterprises, deliberately predatory in character. These blackmail enterprises secured profits from three sources: on the sale of bonds to the public, by the construction company device promoters used to plunder the treasury by charging exorbitant building prices, and by sale of the new railroad to the competitor whose lines it usually paralleled. One of these blackmail enterprises was the nickel plate, paralleling the New York Central from Buffalo to Chicago, yield at a nominal price to sell on extortionate terms. A disastrous rate war ensued, complicated by another rate war with Erie, in which Vanderbilt broke a pool agreement in or ER to meet the menace of the nickel plate and bankrupt. Campaign was organized to compel Vanderbilt to buy TR Pustatum cans, being used such as circulating rumors, a Aod contemplated purchase to wage war against. NTE and Vanderbilt had to buy out the competitor. NV Edu Acmail threat appeared in the form of the new Yacht C CSTS 110RC in Buffa Railroad, built to parallel Chase Entra and dragoon it into an extortionate purr. The House of Morgan, other NDL JW position in comparison with that of Yorkshire, Larley E watered stock of new. T, Boveshore Hood in, F Winslow Low R promoters greater than including General Edward Errol Horace Porter Orv George M. Pullman and Gentha Road, its antecessor, NIS. An instruction company to build it was to receive SV NGGT, against which this plundering MN ashore stock and bonds. G contributed directly to West Shore's insult, reorganizing railroads. Vency, together with more than ordinary mismanagement. Receivership made matters worse. Rates were cut in order to secure business and compel New York Central to buy the West Shore. In 1884, working expenditures were more than gross earnings, and next year the road defaulted on its interest. Vanderbilt was pressed to buy West Shore but refused, favoring a war of extermination. Meanwhile, the rate war went on. West Shore did not earn enough for operating expenses, and New York Central's net earnings declined alarmingly. Three different plans of reorganizing the West Shore were abandoned owing to Vanderbilt interposing obstacles in his decision to wage a war of extermination. In 1886, Drexel, Morgan and Company undertook the reorganization as part of a larger policy to produce more harmonious relations among the railroads. The success of Morgan's West Shore reorganization, according to contemporary opinion, was much greater than anticipated. It was drastic, the bondholders being offered $25 million of 4% bonds for their $50,000. 0.0000 of 5% bonds. The bondholders committee tried to secure better terms but reported that their efforts had been in vain. Drexel, Morgan and Company, rejecting all modifications. 2 shares of old West Shore stock were exchanged for one in the new company and assessed $5. Morgan compelled Vanderbilt to accept the agreement, West Shore being leased to New York Central on its guarantee of principal and interest on the bonds of the new company, J.S. Morgan and Company, becoming its London agents. This reorganization of West Shore depended upon W.W.H. Vanderbilt, whose acquiescence Morgan secured by using the pressure of another reorganization. The South Pennsylvania Railroad, a parallel railroad Vanderbilt himself was construct. 149. In 1886, Drexel, Morgan and Company joined with a group of other bankers in petitioning the governing committee of the New York Stock Exchange not to list an issue of $3,500. 0.0000 Georgia state bonds on the ground that Georgia had repudiated $8,000. 0.0000 bonds issued by the carpetbag government in 1868 to 72. Henry Clues, 50 years in Wall Street P. 150 the House of Morgan, aimed to compete against the Pennsylvania Railroad. Allied with Vanderbilt in this enterprise were the Philadelphia and Reading and Lakeshore Railroads and a group of capitalists including John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Stephen B. Elkins, and Henry C. Frick. It was a formidable combination, Rockefeller participating as part of a campaign to force secret rates, rebates, and drawbacks from the Pennsylvania, which resisted his demands. President George D. Roberts of the Pennsylvania branded the proposed railroad blackmail and prepared to fight vigorously. The situation threatened disastrous rate wars among three powerful railroads, increasing the prevailing demoralization. But Vanderbilt, never very courageous, became frightened and decided to withdraw, against the wishes of most of the other capitalists interested in the South Pennsylvania project. Andrew Carnegie asked Roberts to buy the new road, but Roberts declined. Then a J. Drexel, upon Vanderbilt's suggestion, approached Roberts, who replied, "I am not anxious to buy a hole in the ground." This was in 1885. Morgan had just returned from Europe, and criticism there of American railroad demoralization still rang unpleasantly in his ears. Most American railroad securities listed on the London Stock Exchange were paying nothing to their owners. This directly affected Morgan as an international banker. Moreover, he was actively interested in both the Pennsylvania and New York Central. And a war between the two was not in accord with the conception of community of interest, which was now Morgan's policy. In his own words, Morgan decided that something should be done to bring more harmony among the trunk lines. Morgan's decision involved reorganization of West Shore. The Pennsylvania Railroad in 1869 had itself begun construction parallel railroad against the Baltimore and Ohio, which answered by INVA, the Pennsylvania's territory, producing rate wars, litigation, and lobbying legislative favors. Edward Hungerford, The Story of the Baltimore and UPP, 103. Reorganizing railroads, 151 in South Pennsylvania. This meant fighting Vanderbilt, who, while anxious for a compromise on the South Pennsylvania, was determined to wage a war of extermination against West Shore, the group of capitalists associated with Vanderbilt, including John D. Rockefeller maneuvering his Standard Oil monopoly, the Philadelphia and Reading management out after competitive advantages over the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Pennsylvania itself, whose president was determined not to compromise. Opposition seldom frightened Morgan, however, simply nerving him for the struggle, merciless, domineering, bigger than the men who disputed his power. Although his proposals were usually peaceful compromises in the interest of all concerned, emphasized by his insisting on community of interest instead of destructive competition, they often met the opposition of men accustomed to other manners, men who resented the Morgan overlordship accompanying the community of interest proposal and whose opposition had to be forcibly overcome. And an investigation by Pennsylvania's Attorney General Morgan described his procedure to compel harmony. I made a trip to Philadelphia and suggested to President Roberts that if the Pennsylvania Railroad was prepared to take the South Pennsylvania for bonds or any other security that bore 3%, I thought the thing could be carried through. Roberts doubted the policy or the ability of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company as such to buy off or in any other way interfere with what might be considered rival roads. Later, I arranged a meeting on my yacht between Roberts, Thompson, Chauncey Depew, president of New York Central and Vanderbilt's man Friday, and myself. At the meeting, there was practically an agreement reached on the plan ultimately carried out. That meeting on the Corsair, Morgan's yacht, was curious and not precisely peaceful. Morgan had approached the prob, 152. Lem in terms of personal power. I decided, he said, that something should be done. The developing dictator proposed an agreement to Roberts, which the Pennsylvania's president angrily rejected. The Corsair steamed idly to and fro. Roberts and Depew did the talking. The massive Morgan, 6 feet and 200 pounds of him, sprawled in a chair, truculently silent, smoking his eternal big black cigar, intervening in the discussion now and then in his sharp, brusque fashion. The Corsair steamed idly on until nightfall. Roberts maintained his objections, insisting on war and punishment of the South Pennsylvania promoters. But to insist on war meant not only fighting the powerful Vanderbilt interests, but probably also Drexel, Morgan, and Company, the Pennsylvania's own fiscal agents. In addition to Morgan's financial power and personality, there was his argument, in Roberts' words, that some understanding should be had among the larger railroads of the country with the view to securing remunerative rates of traffic and to securing harmony among the lines. 11 by Morgan's plan New York Central was to acquire West Shore and the South Pennsylvania. Roberts finally yielded. We then went to work with Vanderbilt, Morgan's testimony proceeded, it being believed that sufficient influence could be brought to bear to induce him to supply a majority or more of the South Pennsylvania subscriptions. Vanderbilt did. Of the influence used, Morgan said nothing. The problem was not to induce Vanderbilt to sell South Pennsylvania, but to buy West Shore, Morgan making one dependent upon the other. Vanderbilt accepted, acceptance being a peace offering to the Pennsylvania 13 and to the House of Morgan. A provision of the Pennsylvania State Constitution prevented the Pennsylvania Railroad from purchasing a competing line. In order to evade this provision, said the Railroad Gazette, the House of Morgan, reorganizing railroads J53. J. Pierpont Morgan will be the nominal purchaser, One Morgan blandly explained this transaction on the witness stand. Roberts said it was necessary for someone to be the purchaser of the South Pennsylvania other than the Pennsylvania Railroad. As a firm, we, Drexel, Morgan and Company, could not do this, but as an individual feeling the importance of what was at stake. I was prepared to do what I could and to give the use of my name and signature to act as purchaser of one for the other. It was not as simple as all that, being an evasion of the law, but of a law, however, which permitted a blackmail enterprise such as the South Pennsylvania. Things had to be done in spite of the law. 10 years later, in another railroad case, Morgan asked Elbert H. Gary's opinion on the law involved. Gary, I don't think you can legally do that. Morgan, stormily, don't know as I want a lawyer to tell me what I cannot do. I hire him to tell me how to do what I want to do. In answer to Roberts' objection that buying South Pennsylvania and consolidating it with the Pennsylvania meant helping the promoters out of a bad mess, Morgan had said, "Oh no, they'll not get out whole." They didn't. Capitalization and debts were drastically scaled down, after which 3% bonds were issued to the South Pennsylvania promoters, a considerable financial sacrifice for Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and the others. Violent protests met the settlement, particularly ROM, the Philadelphia and Reading and Pittsburgh interests seeking a competitor to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Morgan ignored the protests. The Philadelphia and Reading accused Vanderbilt, himself a large stockholder in the road, of treachery, as after an agreement with him, Reading had purchased stock in South Pennsylvania and spent considerable money constructing terminals to make connections with the new railroad. Under 154, the House of Morgan. Pressure from disgruntled interests, Pennsylvania's Attorney General investigated the whole transaction, but to no avail. During these struggles, Philadelphia and Reading was in receivership, the direct consequence of financiering considered scandalous by contemporary opinion, aggravated by factional disputes among stockholders and considerable litigation. An important railroad, Philadelphia and Reading, owned immense coal and iron mines, in the acquisition of which it had piled up oppressive fixed charges, increased still more by attempts to secure a coal monopoly and crush competitors. High dividends were paid on watered stock while bonded indebtedness increased disastrously. Bankruptcy came in 1880, reorganization and bankruptcy again in 1884. For 2 years, Philadelphia and Reading interests had unsuccessfully tried to agree on a reorganization plan. After discussing the situation with President Roberts of the Pennsylvania and other railroad and coal interests, Morgan offered to reorganize Reading. The first requirement in Morgan S. plan, developing a system of community of interest, was maintenance of harmonious relations, particularly in the coal business, in order that suitable prices may be obtained for coal produced and shipped. Morgan pledged himself to bring about satisfactory arrangements with all the anthracite roads and also the trunk lines, which shall secure to the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company, when reorganized, its just share of the business at remunerative rates. 20. Reading's fixed charges were to be scaled down severely and the floating debt wiped out by assessments upon the stockholders. The Morgan Syndicate was to advance $15 million, 5% of which was to be its compensation plus 6% on all advances. Control of the reorganized company to be vested in a voting trust 21, that is, a group of trustees exercising all the voting power of the stockholders. A considerable minority considered Morgan's reorganization, reorganizing railroads 155. Plan oppressive, and a sharp struggle developed. This compelled comparatively unimportant modifications of the original plan, including minority representation on the Reconstruction Committee and enlarging the syndicate by $4 million additional subscriptions. The agreement providing that the names and amounts of subscriptions be approved by J. Pierpont Morgan. 22 control of the reorganized Philadelphia and Reading was vested for 5 years in a voting trust composed of Morgan and 4 others 28, assuring control by the House of Morgan. In the midst of these reorganizations, Morgan had his first clash with Edward H. Harriman. The victory was Harriman's. This clash was reminiscent of the struggle with Jay Gould and Jim Fisk for control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, except in the resort to physical force. Entering the railroad field by buying a financially demoralized railroad, reorganizing and selling it at a large profit by playing the Pennsylvania against New York Central. Harriman was now a director in power in the Illinois Central Railroad. Illinois Central had a lease on the Dubuque and Sioux City Railroad which expired in 1887, and Harriman was authorized to get control of the road by negotiation or stock purchase. Learning of this, a group of Dubuque stockholders decided to squeeze Illinois Central by extorting more for their stock than the market price. Their stock, a majority, was placed in the hands of Drexel, Morgan and Company. For sale, Harriman buying up the balance. 2. Apparently Morgan controlled the situation, having the majority stock and able to dictate terms. But Harriman was aware of some things Morgan overlooked. At the Dubuque stockholders meeting, Harriman controlled a majority of the stock present, and he rejected all proxies as illegal in Iowa. This struck a blow at the Morgan party and created an uproar, but was not catastrophic. Then, amid sheer amazement and indignation, Harriman Calmelv rejected the stock held by Drexel, 156, the House of Morgan. Morgan and Company on the ground that it was signed by Drexel, Morgan and Company personally and not as trustees. Imperturbably, Harriman silenced all protests, the only stock voted being his own and that of his associates. 2 feet. Sharp work, but effective. The result, as in the case of Albany and Susquehanna, was the election of 2 boards of directors, one including J.P. Morgan, and throwing the case into the courts. But Morgan was compelled to accept Harriman's terms for the Dubuque stock. Harriman's victory surprised Wall Street, it being Morgan's first defeat and by an antagonist comparatively unknown. Morgan developed a violent dislike of Harriman, whom he could never intimidate, sufficient cause for dislike, which became hatred as the 2 men clashed again in later years. Most of Morgan's few defeats were inflicted by Harriman. Morgan met another setback in his plans for control of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. An aggressive competitor which rejected harmony with other lines cut rates and clashed repeatedly with the Pennsylvania. Drexel, Morgan and Company offered to raise money for Baltimore and Ohio on 2 conditions: the management to be put in competent hands satisfactory to Morgan, and an arrangement be made with the Pennsylvania on the basis of general community of interest. The offer was accepted, Samuel Spencer becoming president. Spencer's management met opposition, and the opposition maintaining that Drexel, Morgan and Company were trying to get control of the Baltimore and Ohio, ousted Spencer after 1 year in the presidency. In 1888, Drexel, Morgan Company were completely successful in reorganizing C.P. Huntington's Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. The reorganization followed the general Morgan pattern, including 5-year control by a voting trust composed of Morgan and 2 others. 2 feet. A Morgan representative was elected president of the reorganized company. 2 feet close business relations and community of interest being established with reorganizing railroads. Other railroads under control or influence of the House of Morgan. Morgan's railroad reorganizations were constructive but drastic, opposition being ruthlessly suppressed, finance imposing its will equally upon managements and stockholders. The profits were very large, reorganization commissions ranging from 81 million to 83,000. 0000 for knowing how to do it and doing it. A Morgan's railroad reorganizations developed 3 decisive aspects. Financial reorganization. The insolvent railroad was financially rehabilitated and put on a paying basis. The pressing immediate problem. Consolidation and community of interest. Morgan's reorganizations always lessened competition among the railroads, either by direct consolidation or establishing harmonious relations on the basis of community of interest. In the case of the South Pennsylvania and West Shore, consolidation. In the others, community of interest. This community of interest was established by Morgan or his representatives, participating in the directorates of reorganized railroads and compelling harmony with other railroads with which the House of Morgan was affiliated. Control. A variety of means: the voting trust, stock purchase, and interlocking directors. The House of Morgan retained control of reorganized railroads. Originally to ensure fulfillment of reorganization agreements and later as an expression of deliberate Morganization. In these railroad reorganizations, Morgan was a financier directly participating in the control of industry, imparting new functions to investment banking and gradually mastering the 157. While reorganizing railroads, J.P. Morgan was penetrating other corporate enterprises, becoming, for example, a director in the Western Union Telegraph Company, under Jay Gould's control. By organizing to build parallel telegraph lines, cutting rates and the older company's profits, manipulating the stock and other characteristic means, Gould acquired control of Western Union. Henry Clues, 40 years in Wall Street, p. 158, most powerful men of his age. Out of the conditions and problems of railroad reorganization emerged the larger aspects and final character of Morganization, the consolidation, combination and centralization of industry and finance by institutionalizing the control of finance over industry. Industrial and financial developments imposed a definite pattern upon the railroad reorganizations of the House of Morgan. The House of Morgan. Chapter X, second. Developing financial dictatorship. She was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire Cat sitting on a bough of a tree a few yards off. It had very long claws and a great many teeth, so Alice felt it ought to be treated with respect. Alice, Indiana Wonderland. The House of Morgan's reorganizations imposed consolidation and community of interest upon particular railroads. In terms of profit, Morgan might have stopped there, but there were other considerations. Unrestrained competition and demoralization still prevailed, and they affected Morgan's reorganizations. Immediate problems merged in the general. Unity and order were indispensable among the railroads as a whole. Consolidations, pools, and gentlemen's agreements had tried to produce unity and order, and failed miserably. Some force outside the railroad managements was necessary. J. Pierpont Morgan decided on larger intervention, expressing his own impulse to impose order and rule, and the new functions being assumed by finance as the balance wheel in the complex relationships of large-scale business enterprise. In 1889, Morgan mobilized the financial power of his own and other investment banking houses to compel community of interest among the Western railroads, where buccaneering and demoralization flourished most disastrously. Upon invitation of the House of Morgan and its affiliates, the Western Railroad presidents, powerful men usually brooking neither interference nor control, met in conference under Morgan's chairmanship to consider establishing harmonious relations among themselves in place of unrestrained competition. And T60, the House of Morgan, rate wars. Most of the presidents came under duress, compelled by necessity and the threatening character of Morgan's financial mobilization. The New York Times interpreted the conference's decisions in terms of bankers' triumph, railway presidents' surrender, marking the definite emergence of Morgan's financial dictatorship. While the conference met to consider the problems of railroad demoralization in terms of unrestrained competition, rate wars, and community of interest, including industrial and financial centralization, there was a larger political problem: public antagonism and government intervention. Morganization was not simply a financial technique. New economic functions and institutions are not developed by economic changes alone, but are modified and shaped by political forces expressing the clash of different class interests in the community. Morganization assumed the institutionalized importance of a technique imposing the control of finance over industry in the midst of the onward sweep of concentrated capitalism, of the violent antagonisms aroused, and the consequent struggle of class against class. Morgan's reorganizations and consolidations solved the immediate problems of competition, insolvency, and profits. But they did not solve the larger problem of the antagonisms aroused by the railroad's oppressive power and their share in the development of industrial combination. Themselves large aggregations of corporate capital, railroads were mighty factors in the crushing of small-scale industry and free competition by industrial combinations. While economically inevitable, combinations were accompanied by the oppression of small businessmen, farmers, and workers, who revolted and asked plaintively, what can be done to ensure the enterprises of men of moderate means against the overwhelming competition of aggregated wealth? The crushing of small-scale industry and competition by corporate enterprise which produced Morganization arose out. Morgan at 45. James J. Hill. Financial dictatorship of the urge for more efficient production, making larger industrial units mandatory. Inefficient, wasteful, ruthless competition itself compelled combination. But combinations waged the battle of competition by other means than economic efficiency. Receiving secret railroad rates and rebates effectively helped corporate enterprise crush competitors. Profit margins were not large, and even a small difference in shipping rates might mean the difference between business success or failure. This meant that competition, theoretically waged by improving technological efficiency and cheapening the price of goods, might favor a comparatively inefficient but unscrupulous corporation receiving lower railroad rates as against a more efficient competitor. Manufacturers and railroad magnates made secret agreements discriminating against other manufacturers, the purpose being competitive gains and not efficiency. John D. Rockefeller characterized the age in his systematic, unscrupulous use of discriminatory railroad rates in building up the Standard Oil monopoly. In 1872, Rockefeller's South Improvement Company made an agreement with the Erie, New York Central, Lake Shore, and Pennsylvania, by which these railroads agreed to maintain the business of the South Improvement Company against loss or injury by competition, and to that end shall lower or raise the gross rates of transportation, as may be necessary to overcome such competition. The Rockefeller oil interests not only received lower rates, but a drawback. That is, the railroads agreed to pay the Standard Oil interests the excess in rates charged their competitors. 1. Curiously, Vanderbilt, Roberts, and other hard-boiled railroad magnates accepted an agreement exclusively in Rockefeller's interest. Sanctimonious John D. not only made it difficult for competitors to ship oil, but every barrel they did ship yielded him a profit. A storm of indignation compelled revocation of the agreement when its terms became public. In later years, Rockefeller ascribed Standard Oil's success to its cheapening the 161. I6I, the House of Morgan, gathering and distribution of oils, using the most efficient methods and encouraging exports. True, but improvements were neither exclusive with Standard Oil nor decisive in winning the battle of competition, which was waged by means of intrigues, discriminatory railroad rates, business blackmail, and expropriating competitors' property. Standard's competitors used the same methods where they could, a savage struggle for survival, all means being justified in terms of prevailing business skullduggery. In spite of public condemnation, Standard Oil persisted in extorting discriminatory rates from railroads, afterwards secured by John D. Rockefeller becoming a power himself in the railroads, particularly New York Central, Erie, and Pennsylvania. Rate discrimination was general and infuriated small businessmen to revolt. The farmers also were in revolt. Developing capitalism subordinated agriculture to industry crushed the old agrarian democracy. A fringe of prosperous farmers was enriched by rising land values and investments in stocks and bonds, but the majority did not prosper much. While agricultural productivity increased immensely, output per man rising more than threefold in 20 years, the farmer's relative share of the national income declined considerably. Tenancy and mortgages increased steadily, while declining prices made it difficult for the farmers to get out of debt. Railroads in particular and monopoly in general aroused agrarian wrath. Where farmers were not oppressed by excessive rates, they were outraged by scandalous discriminations favoring one agricultural community against another. Frequently, pioneers settled in the wilderness upon promise of a railroad which never materialized and were stranded, speculative promoters profiting from sales of land received in grants from the government. The farmers' prosperity depended upon cheap transportation to the anthracite-coal combination, maintained by railroads as mine operators in control of 75% of the anthracite coal fields, later coming under Morgan's control, crushed its competitors by denying them transportation facilities. Arthur T. Hadley, Railroad Transportation, pp. 68. Financial dictatorship, secure which they often invested in railroads, which then charged high rates, paid no dividends, or went into bankruptcy, the farmer stock being wiped out in reorganizations. Railroad magnates insisted lower rates would be ruinous, as dividends were already small, but these dividends were paid on watered stock. The Granger movement, organizing the agrarian revolt and condemning railroads as guilty of arbitrary extortion and opposed to free institutions. 3. Captured control of several state legislatures and imposed severe regulations upon the profits, operation, and political relations of the railroads. Much of this legislation was nullified by court decisions, the railroads high-handedly insisting that neither nation, state, nor public could interfere with their operations. But the movement persisted until a measure of government control emerged. Labor revolt assumed the form of strikes in union organization. Crushed during the Civil War, unions now multiplied and developed real power. Industrial productivity increased almost 2%, and while real wages rose considerably, this was partly offset by recurring business depressions and severe unemployment. The concentration of wealth sharpened discontent, the industrial and financial aristocracy amassing enormous riches. In 1888, 100 persons owned more than $3 billion, including John Jacob Astor, $150 million, John D. Rockefeller, W. K. Vanderbilt, and Jay Gould, each $100,000, 0000, and J. P. Morgan, Junius Morgan, and a J. Drexel, $25 million each. These fortunes, even if cut in half as they should be, were then startlingly large, although they were to become larger. If the magnates of money were contemptuous of the public, they were brutal toward labor. Again, the railroads characterized the general situation. Conditions of labor were almost unbearable, low wages accompanied by denial of elementary rights. When in 1877 railroad managements announced a 10% reduction in wages, discontent flared up in a great strike movement. The Pittsburgh, 163, 164, the House of Morgan. Chamber of Commerce, while condemning the strikes as insurrection, widespread anarchy, and an organized war of rebellion against all constituted authority, admitted that the wages received were insufficient to support life, and it was everywhere apparent that strikes would assuredly result from the repeated and swift recurring reductions of the wages of the men. Another series of strikes broke out on Jay Gould's Western railroads in 1884 to 86, in which the unions, at first successful, were finally crushed, as Gould had crushed the Telegraphers' Union. Unionism was given short shrift by Morgan's reorganized railroads and wages often cut on pleas of economy. General opinion insisted that the railroads were striving to stem the tide of gross mismanagement and personal, local, and corporate rivalry, which has been destructive of the property they were pledged to protect by striking a blow at the wages of overworked men. They give another turn to the screw upon wages, but make no efforts to reform themselves. Ideals of petty industry, of free competition, animated the war of small businessmen, farmers, and labor against the railroads and other corporate combinations. Competitive individualism, the product of petty capitalist enterprise and pioneer traditions, rejected equally laws for the protection of labor and protection of the public against corporate abuses, and these laws consequently were behind the standards of most other nations. Necessity partly modified this individualist ideology, which hampered the introduction of government regulation and control. Legislatures under control of agrarian grangers passed laws imposing regulation on the railroads in spite of violent opposition, the constitutionality of which was sustained after preliminary reverses. But state regulation was insufficient, considering the interstate character of railroads and the Supreme Court decision that states could not regulate interstate traffic. In 1884 to 86, the struggle converged in an overwhelming campaign for legislation by the national government. And in 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Financial Dictatorship Act, a compromise measure neglecting the decisive issue of rate making but prohibiting rebates and discriminations of all sorts, pooling and traffic agreements, and other abuses. The Interstate Commerce Commission being established to enforce the law are. Railroads opposed the Interstate Commerce Act publicly and secretly, while judicial decisions emasculated the Commission's powers. In spite of the Act and the Commission, rebates and discriminations persisted, Standard Oil being still the most scandalous beneficiary. There developed agitation for still more regulation and a growing threat of possible government ownership of railroads. The immediate effect of the Interstate Commerce Act was to increase demoralization among the railroads. In spite of public antagonism, consolidation had proceeded steadily. where in 1870 the New York Central with 700 miles was considered one of the world's great railroads. By 1889-28, railroad systems ranging from 2,000 to 5,000 miles controlled 44% of all mileage. The lessening of competition by consolidation was supplemented by partly successful agreements on rates, as in price pools among industrial combinations, but these agreements were now illegal. Competition broke forth disastrously, aggravated by the construction of unnecessary and parallel railroads. Government regulation and control could function effectively only on the basis of definite unified railroad systems, but the Interstate Commerce Commission and public opinion, animated by the theory of free competition, condemned consolidation and combination. Nor did the Commission act to prevent construction of unnecessary and parallel railroads, since the theory was that competition meant lower rates and better service, although in fact it meant demoralization. Railroad men considered new construction the most serious danger, after condemning Congress for not creating govern. I-66, the House of Morgan. Mental checks upon unnecessary construction, the railway world called upon the bankers for action. The extent to which the impending danger of a new era of feverish construction may run must depend very largely upon the custodians of credit. The peril may be arrested if banks and bankers will do their part toward discouraging all questionable railway loans. The railroad speculators must be told that there is no money for them. This, then, was the situation. Public clamor against the railroads compelled government action. But government action was largely nullified by its insistence on competition and the railroad management's opposition. Competition and mismanagement wrecked profits. In 1888, although gross earnings increased 3.5%, net earnings decreased 6%. 11. Aggravating the situation for the railroads loomed the threat of more thorough regulation, if not government ownership. J.P. Morgan decided to intervene on a larger scale. A private and confidential circular was issued by Drexel, Morgan and Company, Brown Brothers and Company, and Kidder, Peabody and Company, all of them railroad powers, particularly the House of Morgan. The circular called the Western Railroad presidents to a conference at Morgan's home to form an association to enforce provisions of the Interstate Commerce Act and maintain public, reasonable, uniform, and stable rates. 12 Financial Power moved definitely to impose its control. The first conference in December, 188 grams, adopted a preliminary agreement to maintain rates for 60 days after January the 1st. Jay Gould was a holdout, preferring buccaneering independence. The railroad officers who were present, said Morgan optimistically, were earnest in their wish to secure a lasting peace. I consider the Western rate wars as practically at an end. Meanwhile, more comprehensive plans were to be worked out, and another conference scheduled for January, 1889.13. Most of the Western Railroad presidents came unwillingly to the conferences, but they came. Some declined. One Pressey, financial dictatorship. Dent declared publicly that no combination of bankers can set up to whip the country's railway managers into line like so many senseless cattle. The Chicago and Alton Railroad refused to participate in the conference, arguing that it was not in harmony with the Interstate Commerce Act. But giving the real reason in the words, "We don't need any conservators over a property just yet. We are responsible to our security holders, not to Wall Street." 14. Morgan's conferences and proposals meant imposing the control of financiers over independent railroad managements. An emerging financial dictatorship, and managements resisted. Morgan presided at the conference on January 8th. The bankers' representation included Brown Bros. And Kidder, Peabody and Company, powerful investment institutions which accepted Morgan's directives, and also important foreign affiliations. J. S. Morgan and Company, the Barings and others. It was an overwhelming amalgamation of financial power, mobilized by Morgan, aggressive and threatening, prepared to compel obedience. Most of the Western Railroad presidents were there, including Jay Gould of Missouri Pacific and Charles Francis Adams of Union Pacific. The conference was considered so vital that Eastern Railroad presidents participated, including George D. Roberts of the Pennsylvania and Chauncey M. Depew of New York Central, of which roads the Morgans were fiscal agents. The conferees represented perhaps 2/3 of the nation's railroad mileage, upon which Morgan proposed to fasten financial mastery. At this conference, finance, under overlordship of the House of Morgan, represented some of the more constructive aspects of business, moving to impose unity and control upon corporate enterprise. The situation offered an opportunity for the expression of Morgan's characteristics, his dislike of disorder and competition, his insistence upon order and business efficiency, his impulse to rule and dominate other men. The conference met in Morgan's library amid books Manu, 167, 168 the House of Morgan, scripts and art which had probably seen the kings of old imposing their royal will. Now another royalty emerged, the royalty of financial power. For this was not a conference of equals, but a conference met to accept an ultimatum. Massive, threatening, accepting the responsibility of power, Chairman Morgan delivered the ultimatum in his usual direct fashion. The purpose of this meeting is to cause the members of this association to no longer take the law into their own hands when they suspect they have been wronged, as has been too much the practice heretofore. This is not elsewhere customary in civilized communities, and no good reason exists why such a practice should continue among railroads. This was more than direct. It threatened. Behind the threat loomed an immense financial power which, not sufficiently institutionalized to compel customary obedience, spoke in terms of J. Pierpont Morgan's personal power. It was something new to the railroad presidents, accustomed to doing as they pleased, making forays on each other from their baronial domains, and defying the government. They disliked it intensely, as much as feudal barons disliked the development of kingly power. Roberts expressed the feeling clearly, the same Roberts upon whom Morgan had imposed his will in the South Pennsylvania case. Said Roberts, "Speaking on behalf of the railroad people of this country, I object to this very strong language which indicates that we, the railroad people, are a set of anarchists, and this is an attempt to substitute law and arbitration for anarchy might." This plain speaking did not soften tempers and antagonisms. Then B. Stickney of the Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City Railroad objected to the conference's secrecy. "The public are sure to think we are conspiring to do something that we ought not to do." Morgan, in his direct, massive fashion, insisted on the objective creation of a permanent organization of some sort in financial dictatorship, which could be concentrated the power to maintain rates. Tempers and antagonisms flared forth again, and Charles Francis Adams, who had rehabilitated the demoralized and discredited Union Pacific and within a year was to be thrown out by Jay Gould, did some plain speaking of his own. The difficulty in railway management does not lie in an act of legislature, state, or national, but does lie in the covetousness, want of good faith, and low moral tone of railway managers, in the complete absence of any high standard of commercial honor. Now the question we are to decide here today is whether any gentleman representing a railroad company is prepared to stand up and say before the public and before us that he is opposed to obeying the law, and further, that in matters of controversy he prefers to take the law into his own hands rather than submit to arbitration. An unanswerable challenge. The railroad presidents insisted that legislative interference was responsible for the prevailing demoralization, where in fact their own behavior was the primary cause. No one accepted Adams' challenge. The Interstate Commerce Act must be enforced, he insisted, both among yourselves and all others. It is a law, and as such it should bear with equal weight upon all. 1 foot the conference elected a committee of 3 to draw up a plan of organization based upon the original agreement incorporated in Morgan's circular, and discuss it with members of the Interstate Commerce Commission who, while not present, had come to New York because of the conference's importance. The conference reconvened on January 10th. Charles Francis Adams reported for the organization committee, proposing the formation of an Interstate Commerce Railway Commission composed of presidents who were to be held strictly and personally accountable for enforcing the Interstate Commerce Act and maintaining rates. Other provisions included a board of managers to meet monthly or on special call, special committees to regulate changes in rates, disagreements to be decided, the House of Morgan, by the board or by arbitration, a fine of $250 for violations of decisions, and a fund out of which these fines would be paid, to which each railroad was to contribute from $1,000 to $5,000. Acrimonious discussion again, the railroad president's competitive individualism being shocked by the regulatory proposals. Roberts complained of Morgan's harsh language, but I can stand it if the others can, and slashed out at bankers who, with all their horror of railroad wars and cut rates. ARC, usually ready to help along disturbing factors by selling the securities of any parallel railroad, originated. 21 Morgan replied, aware of financial power and accepting its responsibility in regard to the bankers and the construction of parallel lines. I am authorized to say, I think, on behalf of the banking houses represented here, that if an organization can be formed practically upon the basis submitted by the committee, and with an executive committee able to enforce its provisions upon which the bankers shall be represented, they are prepared to say that they will not negotiate, and will do everything in their power to prevent the negotiation of any securities for the construction of parallel lines, or the extension of lines not approved by that executive committee. I wish that distinctly understood. This declaration reveals Morgan's purpose, a compact organization, including financial representation with power to regulate rates, enforce decisions, and control railroad construction. But the proposal did not meet with approval, and a looser form of organization was adopted by the Western presidents, who pledged their personal word of honor that rates would. E maintained. Chauncey Depew read a resolution on behalf AFCEA turn, presidents accepting the conference decisions. Alter the conferees adjourned and left Morgan's home. The Western presidents must have had a slight change of heart. EUIMC lately held another meeting of their own, upper financial dictatorship.